The restraint cuffs closed over Iris Vance's wrists with a sound like a bolt going home, and somewhere above the reclamation chamber a bell that had rung for 11,000 condemned prisoners began its countdown for her. She did not flinch. She counted her own pulse instead, felt it sitting low and unhurried at 51 beats a minute, and decided that was good enough to work with. Species, human, the recorder drone intoned, its lens swiveling above the frame that held her upright against the black stone wall. Designation, Interdiction Tier 9. Charge, unregistered combat capability, resisting lawful conquered arrest, trespass upon sovereign Asheran territory. Sentence, dissolution, effective at the magistrate's word. Understood, Iris said, and that was the first thing about her that unsettled the room, though none of them could have said exactly why. The reclamation chamber of the 9th Correction Vault was built to make small things feel smaller. Black basalt walls rose 40 feet to a domed ceiling of reinforced glass, and through that glass, the daylight of the planet Ressa came down flat and merciless, the kind of noon light that left nowhere to hide a shaking hand. Galleries ringed the upper level, packed with junior magistrates and enforcement cadets sent to observe a dissolution the way other cultures sent their young to watch a controlled burn, instructive, safe, contained. Below them on the floor stood the frame itself. An upright lattice of alloy struts wired into a floor-mounted dissolution coil, humming now at standby power, waiting for someone to raise it to lethal draw. Warden Magistrate Vorothelk walked the length of the chamber floor with his tail held stiff behind him, the posture of a reptile who had learned long ago that dignity was a performance, and had gotten very good at the performance. His scales ran a deep hunting green, mottled darker along the ridges of his skull, and his eyes carried the vertical black slit of a predator that had never, in his species' long history, needed to worry about being prey. He stopped 4 feet from the frame and studied the human the way a man might study a length of rope he intended to buy, checking it for flaws. "You understand the charge," he said. It was not a question. Asheran magistrates did not ask questions of the condemned. They confirmed comprehension and moved on. "You understand the sentence." "I do," Iris said. "You do not appear afraid." "I'm not." A ripple went through the gallery above, not laughter, not yet, but the low clicking murmur of insectoid mandibles rubbing together in something between amusement and disbelief. The enforcement cadets seated closest to the rail were Korath, the Concord's warrior caste, chitin the color of deep water blue and faceted eyes that caught the daylight in 100 small glints. Their species did not laugh with sound. They laughed with motion, with the quick agitated drumming of forelimbs against the rail, and that sound was rising now, a soft percussive murmur spreading through the gallery like wind moving through dry grass. Thelk raised one clawed hand, and the drumming stopped instantly. Asheran magistrates commanded that kind of silence. It was, Iris thought, the only impressive thing she had seen since they marched her in. "Deathworlders," Thelk said, tasting the word the way he might taste something faintly rotten, "have a reputation. I have read the intelligence briefs. Feral biology, elevated pain tolerance, a species that treats a Tier 9 world as a nursery instead of a grave. I confess I expected something larger." "Most people do," Iris said. "You find this amusing?" "No," she said. "I find it useful. You keep telling me what you expect. That's helpful." The vertical slits of his eyes narrowed to threads. Behind him, at the chamber's control lectern, a junior clerk, a smaller, paler Asheran with the soft scale sheen of someone who had never once stood in direct combat, glanced up from his console and then quickly back down, the posture of a man deciding it was safer not to have noticed anything. Thelk turned from her and addressed the gallery instead, his voice pitched to carry to the last row. "You are here to observe the correct procedure for a Tier 9 dissolution. Some of you will serve on frontier stations. Some of you may one day face a specimen like this one in the field, without the benefit of restraints, without the benefit of a coil primed and ready. Watch closely. Learn what confidence looks like in a doomed animal. It is the last thing you will need to recognize before you kill one. Iris let that pass without comment. She was doing the math instead. The standby hum of the coil translated to roughly 40 seconds from full draw to lethal discharge, which meant the safety interlock cycled through 3 stages, which meant there were 3 separate moments where the system was vulnerable to interruption rather than one. She had been in worse rooms with worse odds. She had also, admittedly, been in fewer rooms where they strapped her to a wall first, but the arithmetic did not change because the furniture was unfriendly. "Behavioral logs from the crash site," the clerk read aloud, his voice thin and reedy against the chamber's acoustics. "Note the subject engaged 3 armed Korath patrol units during apprehension. 2 sustained fractures. 1 required medical extraction. The subject sustained no injuries requiring treatment and did not resist restraint once outnumbered 11 to 1. 11 to 1, Thelk repeated, turning back to her. "And you did not run." "Running wastes time," Iris said. "I had somewhere to be." "You are strapped to a dissolution frame," Thelk said, "in the heart of a conquered correction vault, on a world 400 light-years from the nearest human border. Where precisely did you imagine you needed to be?" "Here," Iris said, "eventually." The murmur in the gallery started again, uncertain this time, less amusement than the faint prickling unease of an audience that had just heard a joke it did not understand and suspected, correctly, that it was not meant to be funny. Thelk's tail went still. In 11,000 dissolutions, he had never once had a condemned prisoner answer that question with anything but pleading, denial, or silence. This answer fit none of the categories his species had built for handling fear, and Osharan magistrates trusted very little that did not fit a category. He turned to the clerk. "Confirm restraint integrity before we proceed." The clerk's claws moved across the console. A soft chime answered, green across every field. "Full integrity, magistrate. Cuff tension nominal. Neural suppressant delivering on schedule. She is fully secured." "Good," Thelk said, and something in his shoulders eased, the reflex of a predator reassured by a confirmed cage. He stepped closer to Iris, close enough that she could see the fine capillary branching beneath the scales along his jaw, close enough to smell the mineral must of Osharan skin oil. "Then let us begin the formal record. Deathworlder. Do you have any final statement the conquered archive should preserve?" Iris tipped her head very slightly, the smallest gesture, and looked past him toward the domed ceiling, where the flat noon light of Ressa poured down through 40 feet of reinforced glass onto a floor built to end things. "Just one," she said. "You should check that suppressant line again. It's been running slow for the last 90 seconds. The clerk's head snapped down to his console. For a moment nothing happened. Then the readout flickered, a single field going from green to amber, and the low hum of the dissolution coil seemed, very faintly, to change pitch. "Impossible," the clerk said, though his claws were already flying across the console, pulling up diagnostic trees, cross-referencing dosage curves against elapsed time. "The suppressant is calibrated for human neurochemistry, tested against 17 prior Tier 9 subjects." 17 subjects who weren't me," Iris said. Thelk's slitted eyes fixed on her with new attention, the reassessing stillness of a predator that has just heard something move in grass it thought was empty. "Explain." "Your suppressant works by slowing autonomic response," Iris said, conversational, unhurried, the tone of someone describing weather. "Heart rate, respiration, reflex arc, it's a good drug. It would have dropped a human soldier flat inside 4 minutes. She let the pause sit a beat longer than comfortable. "I've spent 6 years training my resting heart rate down into a range your dosage charts don't have a column for. Your suppressant thinks I'm already sedated. I'm not. I'm just calm." "That is not possible," the clerk said again, weaker this time, because the amber field on his console had just gone red. Thelk did not repeat the clerk's objection. He had commanded frontier stations for 40 years, had watched 100 species try 100 tricks in this chamber, and in others like it across a dozen worlds, and the one lesson those decades had beaten into him was that the condemned who told you exactly what was about to go wrong calmly, in advance, were the ones you needed to worry about. He raised a hand toward the enforcement rail. "Full lockdown on the frame," he snapped. "Secondary restraints now. Get a medic to recheck the dosage manually, and someone silence that gallery." The gallery had already gone quiet on its own. 200 cadets who had come to watch instructive weakness were instead watching a magistrate with 40 years of field command order a full lockdown against a single restrained prisoner, and even the ones too young to know exactly why that mattered understood, on some animal level, that it mattered. Enforcers moved along the catwalks above the frame, and heavy secondary cuffs began to lower on cables toward Iris's ankles and throat, a redundant cage meant to close around a threat that, by every readout in the chamber, should not have existed. Iris watched them descend, with the mild interest of someone watching rain start outside a window she did not intend to walk through. She had roughly 90 seconds before the second set of restraints closed, she judged, and the first set were already loosening by fractions of a millimeter with every controlled flex of her forearm. Not from strength, not yet, not the kind of strength the intelligence briefs had warned them about, but from the simple mechanical truth that a cuff calibrated to a species with looser wrist tendons and a narrower range of joint rotation had never been designed to hold a hand that could fold its own thumb flat against its palm. She folded her thumb flat against her palm. The pain was real. She let it be real and set it aside in the part of her mind that handled inconvenient facts without letting them become the whole conversation, the same part of her mind that had carried her through 6 years of a program that did not have a gentle name because gentleness had never been the point of it. Her right hand slid free of the cuff a half-second before the secondary restraint reached her wrist, and she did not pull it back or hide it. She simply let it hang loose at her side, still cuffed at nothing, 5 fingers relaxed, and waited to see how long it took someone in that chamber to notice. It took 4 seconds. It was the clerk who saw it first, a small strangled sound escaping him before he could stop it, one claw rising to point at her freed hand with the particular horror of a man who has just watched the wallpaper move. Thelk turned. He looked at the hand. He looked at the cuff, still closed, still showing green on every field on the clerk's console, a lock reporting perfect integrity around nothing at all. "Full alert," he said, and his voice had lost the theatrical resonance he had used for the gallery. It was flat now, low, the voice of a soldier rather than a magistrate. "Seal the chamber. Weapons free." The order came 4 seconds too late to matter, and somewhere in the part of him that had spent 40 years reading threats correctly before they became lethal, Varu Thelk already understood that. The Korath enforcers stationed along the gallery rail did not hesitate the way the clerk had. They were warrior caste, bred and drilled for exactly this. Weapons up, sidearms tracking, the chittering discipline of insects that had turned formation combat into an art form centuries before their species built its first starship. 4 of them dropped from the catwalks to the chamber floor in practiced unison, chitin catching the noon light in hard blue flashes, 4-limb blades sliding free of their housings with a sound like knives leaving a drawer. Iris's left hand came free of its cuff a half-second after the right, no drama in it, no wasted motion, and then she stepped out of the frame entirely, the secondary restraints closing on empty alloy behind her with a soft, useless clank. The first enforcer reached her already swinging, blade angled to open her from collarbone to hip, moving with a speed that would have ended most things it had ever been aimed at. Iris did not step back from it. She stepped into it, inside the arc, close enough that the blade's full extension carried past her shoulder instead of through it, and used the enforcer's own forward momentum to redirect the arm 2 inches wide of true. Her free hand found the joint at the base of the forelimb, the soft, unarmored hinge every Korath carried there, a structural necessity of their exoskeleton that no amount of battle-cast breeding had ever managed to plate over, and pressed, once, with the flat precision of someone who had studied the anatomy long before she had ever needed to use it. The enforcer's blade arm went slack. It did not scream, Korath vocalized through their mandibles, and shock had locked its jaw rigid, but it staggered back against the frame with a high, thin whistle of distress through its spiracles, and Iris was already moving past it before it finished falling. The second and third came at her together, a flanking pair drilled to close a gap before a lone target could exploit it, and for half a second it looked, from the gallery, like it might actually work. Then Iris dropped low beneath the crossing arc of both blades, drove her shoulder into the near enforcer's thorax hard enough to buckle its footing, and used the resulting stumble to put its body between herself and the fourth enforcer's rising sidearm. The shot meant for her took the stumbling enforcer instead, a clean hit that dropped it twitching to the basalt floor, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Iris closed the distance to the shooter and put 2 fingers precisely into the same soft hinge joint she had used on the first. 4 enforcers down in under 15 seconds. None of them dead. She had noted distantly, cataloging the fact the way she cataloged everything useful, that killing them would have been easier and taken less precision, and had decided against it anyway, because the mission she had actually come to the 9th correction vault to run did not benefit from a body count the conquered could use to justify what came next. The gallery had stopped murmuring. 200 cadets sat in a silence so total that the only sound in the chamber was the whistling distress breath of the enforcer with the ruined arm and the low, steadily rising hum of the dissolution coil, still armed, still primed, waiting for a target that had walked out from under it. Thelk had not moved from where he stood. He was watching her with the black slit of his pupils gone wide, the reflexive dilation of a predator's eye recalibrating an entire category of threat in real time. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the theater it had held 5 minutes earlier. "Lock the outer doors," he said, not to Iris, not to the gallery, but into the calm bead at his collar, quiet and urgent. "All of them. Nothing leaves this vault level without my direct authorization. And get me a response team to the reclamation chamber, armed, not ceremonial. Now." Iris stood in the center of the floor, 4 enforcers down around her, the frame that had been built to end her life standing empty and humming at her back, and she looked up at the sealed dome 40 feet above, at the flat, unbothered daylight of a planet that had no idea yet what had just started underneath it. "You were right about one thing, Magistrate," she said, and her voice was as calm as it had been when they first closed the cuffs. "I didn't run. I told you. I had somewhere to be." She turned toward the chamber's inner doors, not the sealed outer doors Thelk had just ordered locked, but the maintenance corridor beyond them, the one the vault's own schematics, memorized months before she ever let herself be caught, marked as the shortest route to detention level 4. "Where are you going?" Thelk said. It came out as a demand, not a question, though the tremor underneath it suggested he already suspected the answer would not comfort him. "To get something back that belongs to me," Iris said, and walked toward the doors without hurrying, the same unhurried pace she had used to walk into the chamber 20 minutes before, as if none of what had just happened had cost her anything at all. The maintenance corridor beyond the reclamation chamber ran narrow and low, built for utility drones rather than full-sized bodies, and Iris moved through it at a crouch with the ease of someone who had spent the last 11 weeks studying deck plans stolen from a conquered logistics server by people whose names she would never know, and whose contribution to this moment would never appear in any record. The lights here were dimmer, functional rather than ceremonial, and the air carried the mineral tang of coolant lines running somewhere beneath the floor plating. She had 6 minutes, by her own estimate, before the response team Thelk had called reached the chamber and began working out which way she had gone. 6 minutes was not much. It was, however, enough, because 6 minutes was the number she had built the entire plan around. Back in a briefing room 400 light-years away, in front of a wall covered in the faces of 19 people, the Conquered had listed as killed in action after the loss of a diplomatic transport called the Corvid. 19 faces. 11 were confirmed dead, bodies recovered, no ambiguity. 8 were not. 8 were logged as unaccounted, a phrase that meant nothing and everything, and buried 3 layers deep in intercepted Conquered shipping manifests. The kind of paperwork nobody bothers to encrypt because nobody expects anyone outside the bureaucracy to care about crate counts, was a routing code that placed 8 biological specimens of Tier 9 origin at the 9th Correction Vault on Ressa, delivered 9 months ago. Status: research hold. Iris had volunteered to get herself arrested. It had taken very little effort. A staged border incursion, a fight she made sure looked exactly aggressive enough and no more, and a species with 40 years of confident procedure standing ready to process her through the front door of the one facility she needed to get inside. The corridor forked. She checked the memorized schematic against the physical junction, found them matching to the meter, and took the left branch toward the lift shaft marked for detention level 4. A door hissed open behind her before she reached it. She did not run. Running was a young cadet's mistake, a body's panic response overriding a mind that should have known better, and Iris had trained the panic response out of herself years before anyone handed her a service number. She turned instead, unhurried, and found herself facing a single Korath enforcer standing alone in the side passage, sidearm already raised, close enough that even a mediocre shot would not miss. "Don't," the enforcer said, in the flat clicking cadence of Conquered trade tongue filtered through mandibles never built for human phonemes. "Stop moving. Hands where I can see them." Iris stopped. She raised her hands, palms open, the exact posture of compliance the enforcer's training had told it to expect, and watched the barrel of the sidearm drift a half-inch lower as the enforcer's shoulders eased with the reflexive relief of a threat correctly contained. That half-inch was the only opening she needed. She had already measured the distance between them, 9 feet, closable in under a second and a half by someone who had spent 6 years building exactly that kind of speed into her body, and had spent the 11 weeks since then keeping it sharp. And she crossed it before the enforcer's weapon finished its downward drift, closing the gap low and fast, inside the effective cone of the sidearm before its wielder could correct the angle. The shot went wide, punching a smoking hole through the corridor's coolant conduit instead of through her, and then her hand found the same soft hinge joint at the enforcer's forelimb that had dropped 4 of its fellow enforcers 30 feet and 90 seconds behind her, and the sidearm clattered to the deck plating along with the arm that had held it. She caught the weapon before it hit the floor. She had not planned to carry a Conquered sidearm. The mission profile called for stealth and precision, not a running gunfight, but plans existed to be updated against new information, and the new information was that 6 minutes had just become considerably fewer. "You should have shot first and asked questions never," she told the enforcer, not unkindly, as it slid down the wall clutching its ruined limb. "That's what I would have told your cadets if anyone had asked me to teach the class." The lift at the end of the passage responded to a maintenance override code that had also come from the same anonymous source as the deck plans, and it dropped 4 levels in silence, carrying her down through the vault's administrative decks toward the section the manifests had called, with the particular cruelty of institutional language, research hold. Voruthelk stood over the response team's tactical display 3 levels above her, watching a red marker crawl steadily downward through the vault schematic, and felt something he had not felt in 4 decades of service: the cold, specific dread of realizing that an enemy already understood his own facility better than he did. "She used a maintenance lift," said Enforcer Prime Kes Ithra, the response team's ranking officer, mandibles clicking with barely suppressed agitation as she studied the same display. Ithra's chitin carried the darker banding of Senior Korath Command, and she had commanded the vault's internal security for 6 years without a single successful escape attempt marring her record. That lift requires an engineering override code. She should not have had one. "She should not have had a great many things," Thelk said. "A pain threshold your suppressant charts couldn't measure, a joint structure your restraint cuffs couldn't hold. Apparently now, a maintenance override for a facility she has never set foot inside before today." The intelligence brief said. "I know what the intelligence brief said," Thelk snapped, sharper than he intended, and forced his tail still with an effort that cost him more than he liked to admit. "The intelligence brief said Tier 9 specimens were dangerous in open combat and unpredictable under stress. They did not say anything about a specimen that would let herself be captured, memorize our own facility better than the officers who run it, and walk straight through 11,000 successful dissolutions like they were a door standing open." Ithra's antennae flattened against her skull, the Korath gesture that served the same function human brows did when furrowed in calculation. "You believe this was planned? That she meant to be caught?" "I believe," Thelk said slowly, watching the red marker on the display slow, then stop, at a junction 3 decks below the research holding block, "that we are about to find out exactly why." He was already moving toward the lift bank before he finished the sentence, Ithra falling into step a half-pace behind him, 4 fresh enforcers pulling in around them in a tight defensive formation that Thelk found himself grimly certain would not matter nearly as much as anyone in it currently believed. 4 decks below, Iris stepped out of the lift into a corridor that told her, before she had gone 10 feet, that the manifests had not lied. The air here was colder, filtered through a different system than the administrative decks above, and the walls carried a row of reinforced doors spaced at even intervals, each fitted with a small transparent panel at eye height and a status light glowing a flat, institutional amber. She checked the first panel and felt something in her chest go very still and very quiet, the particular stillness she had trained herself to hold in reserve for exactly this kind of moment, because grief and fury were both luxuries a person in the middle of an active operation could not afford to spend early. The man behind the first panel was asleep, or sedated, curled on a thin cot bolted to the floor, and even through the distortion of the reinforced glass and 9 months of captivity that had stripped weight from his frame and put gray through hair that had been mostly brown the last time she saw him, Iris recognized Sergeant Aldous Hale before she had finished reading the cell's designation plate. Hale had trained her 6 years ago in a facility that did not appear on any public record. He had been the instructor who told a room full of 19-year-olds that the human body's real advantage over every predator species in the galaxy was never speed or strength. Those varied, species to species, world to world, but the capacity to keep a mind clear and a decision sound long after every other creature's nervous system had already surrendered to panic. He had been 51 when he taught her that. He looked through the glass, at least a decade older now. She did not waste time on the door's primary lock. The override code that had gotten her the lift also opened the corridor's emergency release, a Concord failsafe meant for evacuating detention blocks during structural emergencies rather than for prisoners freeing each other. And Iris had planned, months ago, on the assumption that a facility built by a species this confident in its own authority would never have imagined needing to guard that failsafe against the people it was meant to save. The door slid open with a soft pneumatic sigh, and Hale's eyes opened a half-second later, the reflexive alertness of a soldier who had never fully stopped being one even after 9 months in a cell built to grind that reflex down to nothing. "Vance," he said, his voice a dry rasp, disbelief and recognition arriving in the same breath. Tell me you did not just get yourself captured to walk in here. Wouldn't be much of a rescue if I'd stayed outside the wall, Sergeant, Iris said, already moving past him to check the cot for injuries she could treat in the next 90 seconds, and none that required more than that. Can you walk? I can walk, Hale said, pushing himself upright with the stiff, deliberate care of a body that had spent 9 months learning exactly how far it could be pushed before something broke. The others are down this row. 7 more. Price didn't make it 3 months back. They took her for testing and she never came back to the block. The rest of us are still here, because apparently we're more valuable breathing. Iris filed that fact away in the same place she had filed the pain of dislocating her own thumb, real, acknowledged, and set aside for a later hour that operational necessity had not yet made available. Then let's make sure the rest of you stay that way, she said, and moved to the next door. The next 6 doors opened the same way, and behind each one Iris found a face thinner and grayer than the file photos she had memorized, but alive and aware. And after the first shocked moment of recognizing a conquered uniform breaking them out rather than delivering them somewhere worse, moving under their own power within seconds of understanding what was happening. Soldiers, most of them from the Corvid security detachment, plus one civilian systems engineer named Priya Akafar who had been aboard as a diplomatic technical advisor, and had spent 9 months. Iris would learn later, quietly mapping the vault's power grid from inside her cell using nothing but observation, and the stubborn refusal to stop being useful even in captivity. The 8th door did not open the same way. The 7th door, the one at the end of the row, sat behind a heavier seal than the others, a reinforced hatch rather than a simple detention panel, and the status light above it glowed a color none of the others had, a deep clinical blue that Iris did not like the look of before she had even reached it. That one's not a cell, Hale said quietly, coming up beside her, moving with more steadiness now that blood was returning properly to legs that had spent months confined to a narrow cot. That's the lab. They took Corporal Ray's in there 4 weeks ago. Haven't heard him since. Iris studied the hatch's locking mechanism and found it was not keyed to the same emergency failsafe as the detention doors. A separate system, more deliberate, more secure. The kind of security a facility installed around something it considered valuable rather than something it merely wanted contained. Get everyone to the lift, she told Hale. Priority is getting them clear of this level. I'll deal with the lab. Vance. Sergeant. Her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but something in it closed the conversation the way a door closes. You taught me the math on this. 8 went missing. 7 are standing in this corridor right now able to walk. That math doesn't finish itself. Get them to the lift. Hale looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man recognizing, with a mixture of pride and something closer to grief, that the student in front of him had long since stopped needing his permission for anything. Then he nodded and began organizing the 6 freed prisoners and Akafar into a tight formation behind him, moving them toward the lift bank with the economy of a man who had spent 30 years running exactly this kind of extraction before 9 months in a cell had ever happened to him. Iris turned to the lab hatch and had gotten as far as running her fingers along its seam, searching for a manual override the way she had found one for every other lock in this facility, when the corridor behind her filled with the hard, rhythmic clatter of armored footsteps arriving at a run. Enforcer Prime Kes Ithra rounded the corner first, sidearm already tracking, 4 fresh enforcers fanning out behind her into the corridor's width, and behind them, moving with the stiff, controlled fury of a predator whose territory had just been violated in the one way his species considered unforgivable, came Voru Thelk. Stand down, Ithra said, her weapon leveled not at Iris, but at the cluster of freed prisoners now visible near the lift bank, a target selection Iris registered and filed under threats requiring immediate correction. Stand down now, or the specimens die where they stand. Iris turned from the lab hatch, unhurried, and looked at the 6 enforcers, the 2 officers, and the 11 weapons now aimed into a corridor holding 7 unarmed, malnourished former prisoners who had been free for less than 4 minutes. "That's an interesting math problem you've just handed yourself, Enforcer Prime," Iris said. 11 weapons, 7 targets who can't fight back, and exactly one of me standing closer to you than any of your people are standing to them. Ithra's antennae twitched, a flicker of hesitation her training had not prepared her to recognize in herself. "You are outnumbered." "I noticed," Iris said. "You should ask your magistrate how well that worked out for the last 11 people who outnumbered me today." Thelk's voice cut across the corridor before Ithra could answer. "Lower your weapons," he said, and the command came sharp enough that 2 of the enforcers had already begun to comply before he finished the sentence. Ithra shot him a look of open confusion, but training won out over instinct, and 11 barrels drifted a fraction toward the floor. "Magistrate," Ithra said, low, urgent, "she is a single unarmed." "She has not been unarmed since she took Enforcer Kelvath's sidearm 2 decks up," Thelk said, "and she has not needed to be armed to put 4 of your people on the floor in the reclamation chamber. I am not lowering these weapons out of mercy, Enforcer Prime. I am lowering them because I have watched this specimen do arithmetic all day, and every calculation she has run has been correct. I am not interested in finding out what she does to a room where the math tells her the hostages die anyway." It was, Iris thought, the first genuinely intelligent decision anyone in this facility had made since she walked through the front door. She filed it as a data point. Not every alien in this chain of command was a fool, which meant the ones who weren't fools were the ones worth watching most closely from here forward. "You are not leaving this level," Thelk continued, addressing Iris directly now, his tail lashing once against the corridor floor before he brought it back under control. "Whatever you believe you have accomplished here ends at this junction. I have sealed every access point between detention level 4 and the surface. Your people can walk as far as the lift bank. They will not walk any further than that." "You sealed the access points you know about," Iris said. "This facility has an emergency evacuation route rated for a full detention block during atmospheric breach. It runs through the old cargo elevator behind the lab you're standing outside of. Your predecessor had it decommissioned from the official schematics 11 years ago when he redesignated this level for research holding. But decommissioning something on paper doesn't weld the door shut in the wall." The look that crossed Thelk's face then was not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. The specific unease of a man realizing that an adversary he had assumed was operating on instinct and desperation had instead been running a plan with more depth than his own facility's official records. "How?" he said, and for the first time all day the question came out genuine rather than rhetorical. "Do you know the layout of a facility you have never entered before today better than I do?" "Because your people don't guard information the way they guard prisoners," Iris said. "You spent decades assuming a Tier 9 specimen's only threat was its body. Nobody on your side ever considered that the threat might also be patient, might also read, might also wait 11 weeks with a memorized deck plan and a false arrest report instead of walking in the front door swinging." Behind her, Hale had gone still, listening, and something in his exhausted, hollowed-out face had shifted toward an expression Iris recognized from 6 years of training under him. The particular pride of a man watching a lesson land exactly the way he had once hoped it would, in a room he had never expected to see it land in. "Ithra," Thelk said without looking away from Iris, "get the specimens to the surface transport bay. All of them. Now, while she is still talking instead of moving." Ithra hesitated only a fraction of a second before barking the order to her enforcers, and the formation split, half falling in around Hale's group to escort them toward the lift, the other half staying with Thelk. Iris let them go without interference. Getting the freed prisoners clear of the level had been the actual objective from the moment she stepped into the reclamation chamber. Everything else happening in this corridor was, from her perspective, simply the shape the objective had taken once the enemy started reacting to it. "You are going to let them walk out," Thelk said slowly, working through the logic even as he said it, "because you were never trying to leave with them yourself." "Not yet. There's still a locked hatch behind me with a conquered corporal on the other side of it who's been in there 4 weeks without anyone hearing from him," Iris said. "I don't leave a level with someone still unaccounted for. That's not a Tier 9 trait, magistrate. That's just the job." Thelk's eyes moved past her to the lab hatch, and something crossed his face that Iris catalogued immediately, and did not like the shape of not surprise, but the particular discomfort of a man being reminded of something he had spent considerable effort not thinking about. "You do not want to open that hatch," he said. "Try me." "I'm not attempting to protect the corporal from you," Thelk said, and his voice had dropped into a register Iris had not heard from him yet, quieter, almost careful. "I'm attempting to explain that what is behind that hatch is not a rescue anymore. It has not been a rescue for 3 weeks. The research program housed in this facility was never about studying Tier 9 biology from a safe distance, Deathworlder. It was about extracting it, isolating it, finding what makes your species survive worlds that kill everything else, and finding a way to make that survival belong to someone other than you." The corridor went very quiet. Even Ithra, halfway to the lift with her half of the enforcer detail and the 6 ambulatory prisoners, paused to look back. "You're weaponizing us," Iris said, and for the first time since the cuffs had closed around her wrists, her voice carried something other than calm procedural certainty. Not anger, not yet, but the flat, cold recognition of a threat assessment that had just grown considerably larger than the one she had walked in with. "We are attempting to," Thelk said. "The program has had limited success. The corporal behind that hatch is Subject 7. He is the only one who has survived extraction past the 2nd procedural stage." A pause, and something almost like reluctance entered his voice, the closest thing to shame an Osheran magistrate's carefully trained composure allowed. "I did not design this program. I did not request it. I was assigned to oversee its security when the conquered Ministry of Biological Assets designated this vault a research site 11 months ago, and I have spent every day since telling myself that overseeing a program is different from running it." "It isn't," Iris said. "No," Thelk said, after a long moment. "I have begun to understand that it isn't." Iris turned back to the hatch, and found the manual override this time not by searching for a conquered failsafe, but by the simple, ugly logic of a door built to keep something in rather than to let people out during an emergency. A heavier lock, a slower cycle, a mechanism designed by people who had never once imagined needing to open it in a hurry for a good reason. It took her 40 seconds longer than the detention doors had, and in that 40 seconds nobody in the corridor moved to stop her. Not Thelk, not the enforcers still flanking him. A stillness that told Iris more clearly than any confession could have that whatever waited on the other side of that hatch was not something the magistrate wanted to defend. The hatch opened onto cold light and the low mechanical hum of medical equipment, and Corporal Devon Reyes lay on a reclined table in the center of the room, restrained not by cuffs, but by a lattice of intravenous lines and monitoring leads that ran into both arms and a shaved patch at the base of his skull. He was alive. Iris registered that first because it was the fact that mattered most. He was also, unmistakably, no longer entirely the man his service record photo had shown her in the briefing room 400 light-years away. The muscle along his forearm sat wrong, dense and corded in patterns that did not match human anatomy, and a faint mineral sheen had crept across the skin at his temples where the extraction leads clustered thickest, something between scar tissue and scale. "They kept saying it would stabilize," Reyes said, his voice a dry whisper, eyes tracking to her with the slow effort of a man surfacing from deep sedation. Kept saying the last treatment was the one that would take. I stopped believing them around the fourth one. You're done believing them, Iris said, already moving to the monitoring leads, working the release clasps with the same unhurried precision she had used on every lock in this facility, because panic would not get the lines out any faster and might get them out wrong. I've got you. We're leaving. Can I walk? You're going to find out in about 30 seconds, Iris said, and got the last lead free. Behind her, in the corridor, Thelk's comm bead chimed with a priority signal, and whatever came through, it changed the set of his shoulders in a way Iris registered even without hearing the words. He straightened, and something in his posture reverted, the careful, human-adjacent doubt of the last few minutes folding back beneath decades of institutional reflex, the way a man's face closes when a superior officer's voice arrives in his ear. The Ministry Oversight Liaison is demanding a status report, Thelk said, to Ithra, to the enforcers, to no one in particular. She has been informed a Tier 9 specimen breached the reclamation chamber and is loose in research holding with 6 recovered assets. What did you tell her? Ithra asked. I told her the truth, Thelk said, and something bitter entered his voice. Which means she has authorized proscribed countermeasure 7 for this vault level, effective immediately. And she has done it from 400 light-years away without ever once setting foot inside this facility or laying eyes on what has been done here in her ministry's name. Iris, hauling Ray's upright and getting his arm across her shoulders, felt the floor beneath her shift by a degree too small for most species to register and knew, with the flat certainty of someone who had studied conquered facility design as thoroughly as she had studied its personnel doctrine, exactly what that meant. Proscribed countermeasure 7, she said, would be the one where you flood the level with something lethal to organic tissue rather than let a research asset walk out the door. Thelk did not answer, which was its own answer. How long? Iris said. 4 minutes, Thelk said. The seal cycle has already begun. I did not authorize it. I do not have the clearance to stop it. Iris looked at him for a long moment. At a man who had spent the day watching every certainty he owned get dismantled piece by piece, and who was now standing in a corridor about to be flooded with something lethal by a decision made from 400 light-years away by someone who would never have to look at the results. Then you're going to help me get everyone left on this level to that cargo elevator, Iris said. Or you're going to stand there and watch what happens when a species you decided to weaponize runs out of patience with being weaponized. For the first time since the cuffs had closed around her wrists 25 minutes earlier, Voru Thelk made a decision that had nothing to do with procedure, nothing to do with the chain of command that had governed every hour of his 40-year career, and everything to do with the small, stubborn, inconvenient thing that had been growing in him since the moment a condemned prisoner told him to check a suppressant line and turned out to be right. The elevator, he said, this way. Move. They moved fast down the corridor, Thelk in the lead now with the strange, disorienting authority of a man who knew every shortcut in a building he had just decided to betray. Ithra a half-step behind him with her weapon still drawn, but no longer certain what, exactly, she was supposed to be pointing it at. Rays leaned heavily on Iris's shoulder, his altered muscle firing in uneven bursts that made his gait ragged and unpredictable, and behind them the ambient temperature of the corridor had begun, almost imperceptibly, to drop. The first sign, Iris knew from every briefing she had ever sat through on conquered facility countermeasures, of an atmospheric purge sequence beginning to draw down the level's breathable air in preparation for whatever came next. 2 minutes, Thelk said, not slowing. The purge will reach research holding first. It spreads outward from the central seal point. Then we need to be past the seal point before it does, Iris said. The cargo elevator sat behind an unmarked service door at the corridor's far end, exactly where the decommissioned schematics had promised it would be, and Thelk keyed a maintenance override that Iris noted, without surprise, was different from the one that had gotten her this far. A magistrate's clearance code. One more layer of access she had not needed until now and would not have had without him. The door ground open on hinges that had not moved in over a decade, revealing a freight platform large enough for a full detention block's worth of evacuees, and Iris felt the small, cold satisfaction of a plan surviving contact with an enemy that had adapted faster than she expected. It was not relief. She had trained relief out of herself the same way she had trained fear out, because relief this early in an operation was how good operators became dead ones. "Everyone on," she said, and did not have to say it twice. The platform held 14 bodies when the door ground shut behind them, 6 freed prisoners, raised barely upright, Hale steadying 2 of the weaker ones, Iris, and standing apart from the humans with the stiff, uncertain posture of a man who had just crossed a line his species did not have a word for, Voru Thelk. Ithra had not followed. She had stopped at the threshold, weapon still raised, torn between an order she had followed her entire career, and a magistrate who had just abandoned every version of that order in front of her. "Ithra," Thelk said, through the narrowing gap as the door closed. "Report the purge failed to reach full seal before the specimens escaped topside. Tell them a structural fault in the old cargo shaft compromised containment. It will not hold as an explanation for long. It will hold long enough." Ithra said nothing, but she did not raise the alarm before the door sealed, and Iris filed that too, as a data point about which conquered officers might yet prove worth something when this was finished. The elevator rose in silence for the better part of a minute, the platform's ancient mechanism groaning under a load it had not carried in 11 years, and Iris used the time to check Ray's pulse, check the pressure dressing she improvised from a strip torn off her own uniform sleeve for a laceration on his forearm she had not had time to address in the lab, and catalog, with the flat efficiency of triage, which of the 6 freed prisoners would need immediate medical attention the moment they reached anything resembling safety. "You could have let the purge take us," Hale said quietly, close enough to Thelk that only Iris caught it over the elevator's groan. "Would have solved every problem your ministry handed you today in one stroke. Nobody topside would ever have known the difference." "I would have known," Thelk said, and did not elaborate further, and Hale, who had spent 30 years learning to recognize the exact weight a man puts behind 4 words when he means every one of them, did not ask him to. The elevator surfaced into a disused maintenance bay at the edge of the vault's surface transport complex, sunlight spilling in hard and flat through a row of high clear-story windows, and for a moment the 14 of them stood blinking in daylight that 6 of them had not seen in the better part of a year. It lasted 4 seconds. Then the far end of the bay lit up with the harsh strobe of a security alert, and through the open bay doors Iris saw them coming across the transport apron at a dead run. A full compliance squad, 8 strong, moving in the same drilled Korath formation the reclamation chamber's enforcers had used, but armored heavier, moving faster, led by a figure that was not Korath at all. He stood taller than the enforcers flanking him, 4 arms folded in a resting posture that managed to look both scholarly and lethal at once, pale gray skin marked with the fine ceremonial scarification of conquered ministry rank, and where the enforcers carried standard sidearms, each of his 4 hands carried nothing, because, Iris understood immediately, a man who commanded a squad like that one did not need to. "Ministry Compliance Director Vex Sorrel," Thelk said, low, and something in his voice had gone tight in a way Iris had not heard from him even in the reclamation chamber. "He does not travel to correction vaults for status reports. He travels to correction vaults to close them down and erase everyone who was inside." Sorrel stopped at the edge of the bay, 4 arms unfolding with unhurried, deliberate calm, and when he spoke his voice carried the flat, patient cadence of a man who had never once in his career needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Warden Magistrate Thelk," he said, "you have had a difficult afternoon. Step away from the specimens, and we will discuss how to explain your afternoon in terms that do not end your career." "They are not specimens," Thelk said. Sorrel's pale eyes moved past him to Iris, unhurried, cataloging, the same clinical attention she had watched Thelk give her in the reclamation chamber 25 minutes and a lifetime ago. "No," Sorrel agreed, "I don't imagine they are anymore." "Which is precisely the problem the Ministry sent me to correct." "Director," Iris said before Thelk could answer for her, "you should know how this next part is going to go before it happens, because I've found that saves everyone time. You have 8 enforcers and yourself. I have 13 people behind me who cannot fight, 1 magistrate who just burned his own career walking them out of your research block, and exactly 1 operator who can. Those numbers look bad for me on paper." "They looked bad for your reclamation chamber staff on paper too, 40 minutes ago." Sorrel's expression did not change, but something in the set of his 4 shoulders shifted, a recalibration Iris recognized because she had watched the same recalibration cross Thelk's face in the chamber. "You are the specimen who breached containment." "I'm the specimen who came here to collect 8 people your ministry logged as unaccounted for," Iris said. "I've got 7 of them standing behind me. The 8th one is dead because your program killed her 3 months ago during testing, and I intend to make sure the record reflects that clearly enough that nobody in your chain of command gets to call it anything softer." "You misunderstand the scope of what you are threatening," Sorrel said, and for the first time something like genuine curiosity entered his flat clinical tone, the tone of a scholar encountering a specimen that refused to behave according to the literature. "This facility exists because 6 border systems have been lost to Tier 9 incursions in the last decade. Your species does not colonize worlds, Deathworlder. It survives them effortlessly on a scale that terrifies every civilization within 100 light-years of your border, including mine. The program you are so determined to condemn was never cruelty for its own sake. It was survival. We were trying to understand what allows an organism to thrive where nothing else can, so that our own people might someday survive worlds that currently kill us in months." "Then you should have asked," Iris said. The bay went very quiet. "You could have sent an ambassador," Iris said, "a researcher. A formal request through any channel you're conquered has for exactly that kind of diplomacy. And there are channels, Director, plenty of them, because humanity has spent the last 30 years fielding exactly that request from a dozen different species, and answering most of them honestly. Instead, your ministry shot down a diplomatic transport, listed the survivors as dead, and spent 9 months taking a man apart 1 procedural stage at a time to see what made him hard to kill. You didn't lose 6 border systems to us because we're monsters, Director. You lost them because every time your people meet something they don't understand, the first instinct is to cage it and cut it open rather than ask it a question. That instinct is what's about to cost you this facility." Sorrel's 4 hands came together in front of him, slow, deliberate, and Iris watched his fingers interlace with an economy of motion that told her, more clearly than any threat assessment could, that whatever came next from this man would not be careless. "You misjudge your position," he said quietly. "I did not come to this bay with 8 enforcers because I expected to need 8 enforcers against 1 specimen. I came with 8 enforcers because ministry protocol requires a witnessed quorum before authorizing lethal containment of a research asset this valuable. The quorum is now satisfied." His pale eyes swept once across Thelk, across Hale, across the huddled line of freed prisoners behind Iris, and settled back on her with something that was almost disturbingly close to respect. "Take her alive if it can be managed cleanly. If it cannot, the ministry will accept a body. We have learned a great deal today already." The 8 enforcers moved as one, weapons rising, and Iris felt the particular, familiar stillness settle over her that she had felt in the reclamation chamber 26 minutes earlier. Not fear, never fear, but the cold, clean focus of a mind that had already run the arithmetic and did not need to run it twice. "Get everyone behind the loading crates," she said to Hale, not looking away from Sorrel, and did not wait to see it done, because she already knew he would do it correctly. He always had. The first enforcer's shot came a half-second after Sorrel's order finished, and Iris was already 3 feet from where she had been standing when it fired, closing the gap toward the nearest pair of Korath rather than retreating from them, because retreat put more of the fight's duration between now and the moment the freed prisoners were safe, and duration was the one resource in this bay she had no interest in spending. She took the nearest enforcer's weapon arm the same way she had taken 4 of its fellows in the reclamation chamber, the soft hinge joint yielding under 2 fingers of precisely applied pressure, and used the enforcer's own stumbling collapse to put a second attacker's line of fire off target long enough to close on it too. It was not elegant. It was not meant to be. Elegance was for people with time to spare, and Iris had learned 6 years ago that a fight decided in under a minute rarely looked graceful to anyone watching it. Only afterward, in the stillness, when the math finally became visible to everyone who had not been running it in real time. 2 enforcers down in the first 4 seconds. A third came at her from an angle she had not fully accounted for, a heavy overhand strike aimed to drive her into the loading crates, and she took the hit on her raised forearm rather than dodge it clean, absorbing bruising force she would feel clearly in an hour, and could not afford to feel now. Using the half-second the block bought her to drive a palm strike into the joint at the base of the enforcer's mandibles hard enough to buckle its footing. Behind her, near the crates, she heard Hale's voice, low and steady, directing the freed prisoners further back, and beneath it, closer, the distinct crack of conquered small arms fire that was not aimed at her. Thelk. She registered in the same half-second. She registered everything else in the bay, had drawn a sidearm from one of the downed enforcers, and was providing suppressing fire toward the 2 remaining attackers still holding position near Sorrel. An act that would end his career, even if it did not end his life, and one he had made with the same flat certainty she had watched grow in him since the corridor outside the lab. Sorrel had not moved. He stood at the center of the bay, 4 arms still loosely folded, watching the fight collapse around him with the detached clinical attention of a man observing an experiment reach a conclusion he had already anticipated. And Iris understood, closing the last 15 feet between them with the 6th and 7th enforcers down behind her, that he had never intended to win this exchange with numbers. "Impressive," Sorrel said, as she stopped 4 feet from him, close enough now that she could see the faint mechanical seams along the undersides of his upper forearms, plating she had not registered from across the bay. "You have cost my ministry 8 trained enforcers in under 90 seconds. I want you to understand that I am not disappointed by this outcome. I came here to observe, Deathworlder. You have given me a great deal to observe." "Then observe this," Iris said. "I don't want your ministry's data. I don't want your respect. I want you to stand down, hand over every record this vault has generated on the specimens you took, and let us leave. That's the only version of today that ends without more of your people on the floor." "That version was never available," Sorrel said, and his upper arms unfolded with a speed that finally, for the first time all afternoon, caught Iris slightly off guard, not because she had misjudged his intent, but because she had misjudged his mechanism. The seams along his forearms split open along hidden hinges, and from each one extended a thin, humming blade of blue-white energy, close enough to a Korath 4-limb weapon, in principle, that she recognized the threat instantly, different enough in execution that she had no prior data on its reach or its speed. The first strike came fast, faster than she had allowed for, and she felt the energy blade pass close enough along her ribs to scorch fabric before she managed to twist clear of it, a margin measured in inches rather than the comfortable feet she preferred. Sorrel followed the miss with a second strike from his lower left arm, a different angle entirely, 4 limbs moving with a coordination that made him. She registered with the cold clarity of a threat reassessment happening in real time, considerably more dangerous than every enforcer she had put down that day combined. She gave ground twice, deliberately, letting him press the advantage he believed he had found, watching the rhythm of his forearmed strikes settle into a pattern, upper arms leading with speed, lower arms following a half beat behind to cover the gaps the upper arms left open. A fighting style built, she understood, for an opponent who could only track 2 limbs at a time and would run out of ways to dodge 4. Iris was not that opponent. She had spent 6 years training against instructors who threw problems at her from more directions than her eyes could track in real time, precisely so that her body would learn to answer threats her conscious mind hadn't finished processing yet. And when Sorrel's 4th strike came in low, aimed to open her thigh rather than her torso, she was already moving through the gap between his upper arm swing and his lower arm follow, inside his effective range before either blade could correct. Her hand closed on his upper right wrist, just above the energy blade's hilt, and she used his own forward momentum, the same principle that had dropped 4 enforcers in the reclamation chamber, scaled up now against a body with more leverage and more speed than any of them had carried, to redirect the strike past her shoulder and into the loading crate behind her, the blade punching a clean smoking hole through reinforced alloy that told her, with unpleasant clarity, exactly what that blade would have done to her ribs. Sorrel's lower left arm came around in the same instant, and this time she could not fully dodge it. She felt the blade's edge open a shallow line along her forearm, hot and immediate. The first wound of the day she could not set aside to deal with later, because it was still actively bleeding while she needed that arm. She did not stop. She had trained herself out of stopping for pain the same way she had trained herself out of a resting heart rate that fit any conquered dosage chart, and she used the half-second Sorrel spent registering that his strike had landed, and she had not slowed to close the last foot of distance between them, driving her uninjured forearm up and under his jaw with the full weight of her body behind it. It was not an elegant finish. It was not meant to be. Sorrel's head snapped back, his upper body coordination scattering for the critical half-second that 4-limbed combat depended on to function as a system rather than 4 separate fights. And Iris used that half-second to drive her knee into the mechanical seam at his lower ribs, the same soft point logic she had applied to every hinge joint she had found on this world today, and felt something inside the plating give way with a grinding crunch that dropped him to one knee. She did not finish it. She had the opening, his neck exposed, his coordination shattered. Every instinct 6 years of training had built into her screaming that this was the moment to end a threat this dangerous permanently. And she stopped herself a half-second before her hand would have completed the motion, because somewhere in the part of her mind that handled decisions rather than reflexes, she had already made the calculation that a dead ministry compliance director was a martyr her enemies could use, and a living one, broken and humiliated in front of the magistrate who had just defected and the 7 witnesses he had come to erase, was a weapon she could use instead. "Stay down," she told him, her voice as flat and unhurried as it had been in the reclamation chamber 28 minutes ago, blood running warm down her forearm from the shallow wound his blade had left. "You said you came here to observe. You've observed enough." Ithra arrived at the bay's edge 40 seconds later, at the head of a squad that had clearly expected to be storming a hostage situation, and instead found 8 of her own enforcers on the ground, a ministry compliance director kneeling in a spreading stain of his own dark blood with his energy blades retracted and dark, and a magistrate she had served for 6 years standing over him with a stolen sidearm still smoking in his hand. For a long moment nobody in the bay moved. "Enforcer Prime," Thelk said, and his voice, Iris noted, had steadied into something that sounded less like a man improvising and more like a man who had finally decided which version of himself he intended to be for whatever remained of his career. "You have a decision to make in the next 10 seconds, and I will not make it for you." Report this bay secure and hold your position, or report what you actually see. Ithra looked at him, at Sorrel, at Iris standing with blood running down her forearm, and 7 exhausted, malnourished humans huddled behind an alloy crate that a ministry-grade energy blade had punched clean through moments before. And something in her antennae flattened in a way Iris had learned, over the last half hour, to read as a Korith making peace with an outcome she had not chosen but could no longer avoid. "Bay secure," Ithra said, into her calm bead, her mandibles clicking with what might have been the closest thing her species had to bitterness. Compliance Director Sorrel sustained injuries during containment operations. Medical response requested. No further hostiles at this location. It was not the truth. It was, Iris understood, the closest version of the truth that would buy them the time they needed, and she felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise settle into the running calculation she had been keeping since the reclamation chamber. A second conquered officer, in one afternoon, choosing to bend rather than break. "That buys us minutes, not hours," Thelk said, low, moving to Iris's side as she began herding the freed prisoners back toward the bay doors and the transport apron beyond. "Sorrel's escort ship is in orbit. The moment his personal comm goes dark for longer than his usual reporting interval, they will scramble every fighter in the system to this coordinate. Then we need to not be here when they do," Iris said, and keyed the small transmitter concealed in the lining of her collar. The one piece of equipment the vault's intake processing had never found, because it had been sewn into a seam too fine for a standard scan and too mundane-looking to draw a second glance even under a thorough one. The signal it sent was a single burst, 3 characters long, encrypted twice, meaning almost nothing to anyone who might intercept it, and meaning everything to the one small stealth corvette that had been holding position at the edge of Ressa's system for the last 11 weeks, running silent, waiting for exactly this transmission and no other. 60 seconds, Iris said, reading the response ping. "We need to be in open air when they arrive, or this whole plan ends in a very short conversation with a conquered picket ship instead." They moved across the transport apron at the fastest pace the 6 weakest prisoners could manage, Hale and Akafar supporting the 2 who could barely walk, Reyes leaning hard on Iris's uninjured shoulder, Thelk bringing up the rear with the stolen sidearm still in hand, watching the bay doors behind them for a pursuit that had not yet materialized, but that everyone in the group understood was only a matter of minutes away. The sky over Ressa was the flat, bright, merciless noon blue it had been all day, cloudless, and it was into that open, unshielded daylight that the corvette dropped from high orbit 40 seconds later. No fanfare, no dramatic thunder of engines, just a sudden dark shape resolving out of glare and heat shimmer with the quiet, unhurried competence of a vehicle built to be exactly where it was needed and know where its enemies expected to look for it. It touched down at the apron's edge in a rolling wash of displaced dust, a rear ramp already lowering before the landing struts had fully settled, and a woman in cold Wakefield gear appeared at the top of it, weapons slung rather than raised, scanning the group crossing the apron with the fast professional triage of someone counting heads and matching them against a manifest she had memorized weeks ago. "Vance," she called, over the engine's dying whine. "You're late." "I had somewhere to be first," Iris said, which was, she reflected distantly, becoming something close to a personal refrain today, and began herding the freed prisoners up the ramp ahead of her, checking each one across the threshold with the same flat efficiency she had applied to every decision since the cuffs first closed around her wrists. Thelk stopped at the base of the ramp. Iris turned back and found him standing on the sunlit apron, sidearm still loose in one clawed hand, looking up at the open ramp of a human vessel with an expression she had not seen on him yet, not the theatrical certainty of the reclamation chamber, not the cold professional dread of the corridor, but something closer to a man standing at the edge of a door he had spent 40 years being told did not exist. "If I board that ship," he said, "there is no version of my life that continues the way it was this morning. The ministry will list me as a traitor to the conquered within the hour. Every world I have ever served will have my name struck from its record. I will spend whatever remains of my career, and likely my life, as a fugitive from the government I gave 4 decades to." "That's true," Iris said. She did not soften it, because softening it would have been a lie, and she had told him nothing but the truth since the moment they closed the cuffs around her wrists. "It's also true that the other option is staying here to explain to the ministry why you personally opened a lab hatch and walked 7 research assets to a stolen Corvette. I don't think that conversation goes better for you than this one does." "No," Thelk said. "I don't imagine it does." He looked past her, into the ship, at Hale settling the last of the weaker prisoners into a jump seat, at Reyes slumped against the bulkhead with his altered forearms trembling from exertion he was no longer strong enough to fully hide, at 7 people who had been listed as dead for 9 months and were, for the first time since that listing, visibly, undeniably alive. "I did not become a magistrate to preside over that," he said, quiet, mostly to himself. "I told myself for 11 months that overseeing the program was different from running it. You were right, this afternoon, when you told me it wasn't. I would like the chance to be something other than what I was this morning, Deathworlder. I do not know if that chance is worth what it will cost. I know I would rather find out than go back to not knowing." He climbed the ramp without waiting for her answer, and Iris found, watching him go, that she did not have one ready anyway. Only the flat, working certainty that whatever came of a conquered magistrate choosing exile over silence, it was a better outcome than the one the ministry had planned for this facility an hour ago. The ramp sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss, and the pilot's voice came over the ship's internal comm before Iris had finished strapping into the nearest jump seat. "Multiple contacts inbound from orbital picket, 40 seconds out. They've made us. Hold on to something." The Corvette lifted off the apron hard, engines that had been silent on the way down now screaming at full burn, and through the narrow viewport beside her jump seat Iris watched Ressa's flat blue sky tilt and blur, as the pilot took them up on a climbing spiral designed to put as much atmosphere, and as many confusing thermal layers as possible between them, and whatever was coming down to meet them. The first warning shot crossed their bow close enough that the ship's hull groaned under the shockwave, a bright hard streak of directed energy that had come from a conquered interceptor still too far out to have a clean firing solution, and clearly not interested in waiting for one. "They're not trying to disable us," the pilot called back. "They're trying to kill us before we clear the gravity well. Somebody upstairs wants this specimen problem solved permanently." "Then somebody upstairs is about to have a very bad afternoon," Iris said, and unbuckled from the jump seat despite Hale's sharp look of protest, moving forward to the cramped cockpit doorway where she could see the tactical plot for herself. 3 conquered interceptors closing fast from high orbit, sleek predatory shapes built for exactly this kind of intercept, against 1 aging stealth corvette carrying 14 people it could not afford to lose. "Countermeasures," Iris said. "Already running," the pilot said. "Won't hold against 3 of them for long. We need atmosphere between us and their targeting arrays, and we need it in the next 20 seconds, or this conversation ends badly for everyone in the back." The Corvette dove instead of climbing, a maneuver that put a shudder through the whole airframe and drew a strangled gasp from somewhere behind Iris in the passenger compartment, punching back down through the thin upper atmosphere at an angle that traded altitude for the kind of thermal chaos that scrambled targeting solutions built for clean vacuum. One interceptor's shot went wide, tearing a bright scar across empty sky where the Corvette had been a half-second earlier. The second correctly anticipated the maneuver and clipped their aft shielding with a glancing hit that threw sparks across the cockpit console and dropped half their displays to static for 3 full seconds that felt, to Iris, considerably longer than 3 seconds. "Shields at 40%, the pilot said, voice tight but steady, the voice of someone who had run worse numbers than this and come home anyway. One more hit like that and we're not making orbit. Iris looked at the tactical plot, at the third interceptor curving in for what would clearly be the finishing pass, and made the only calculation available to her that did not involve a weapons system this ship did not carry. "Take us back down," she said, "into the canyon system south of the vault. Full atmosphere, full terrain clutter. Make them choose between losing lock on us and flying into rock at that speed." The pilot did not question it. The Corvette rolled hard and dove again, dropping below the interceptor's altitude into a landscape of deep red-walled canyons carved by some ancient river long since gone dry. Terrain close enough on either side that the ship's own collision alarms began chirping insistent warnings the pilot silenced with a sharp, practiced gesture. The lead interceptor followed them in, fast and confident, built for open-sky combat rather than the kind of low, twisting terrain-hugging flight a stealth Corvette's smaller profile handled with considerably more grace, and Iris watched on the plot as the gap between the two ships widened by degrees too small to see with the naked eye but unmistakable on the display. The interceptor's pilot pulling up rather than risk the canyon wall rushing toward their windscreen. Breaking off the pursuit with the particular reluctant discipline of someone who had just done the arithmetic on confidence versus survival, and for the first time all day, chosen correctly. The other two interceptors, still too high, too far out, too committed to a straight orbital intercept to follow the dive in time, fell steadily behind as the Corvette threaded the canyon system and climbed back toward open sky on a new heading, one that put Ressa's curve between them and any clean line of pursuit before the interceptors could correct. "Clear," the pilot said, some 90 seconds later, and Iris heard, in the single flat word, the specific exhaustion of someone who had just spent that 90 seconds convinced they would not survive it. "Jumping in 5. Everybody hold on." The stars outside the viewport smeared into a long bright line and then vanished into the featureless gray of transit space, and Ressa, the flat noon light, the black basalt chamber, the 11,000 dissolutions it had carried out before this one, the vault that had spent 11 months taking a man's body apart to see what made it hard to kill, fell behind them, small and finished, a problem that had, for 14 people at least, stopped being a problem at all. The transit run to the nearest human forward station took 6 hours, and for most of the first 2 of them, nobody in the Corvette's cramped passenger hold spoke much at all. Reyes slept, finally, the deep unbroken sleep of a body that had spent 4 weeks under sedation for reasons that had nothing to do with rest, and Iris sat beside him for the first hour of it with 2 fingers against the pulse at his wrist. Not because the ship's medical scanner couldn't do the job better, but because some part of her that had nothing to do with training wanted to feel herself, that the number stayed steady. Hale found her there in the second hour, settling into the jump seat across from her, with the careful economy of a man whose body was still relearning what it felt like to move without 4 walls closing in 6 feet away in every direction. "You dislocated your own thumb," he said. It was not a question. He had seen the faint discoloration at the joint when she'd stripped off her jacket to let the Corvette's medic close the wound along her forearm, and 30 years of training soldiers had taught him to read an injury's story from its shape alone. "Cuffs weren't built for the range of motion," Iris said, "seemed like the fastest way through them. You could have dislocated the wrist instead and lost the hand for 20 minutes. You chose the thumb because you needed the hand functional in under 60 seconds. Hale's voice carried something that was not quite approval and not quite grief, an instructor's pride tangled up with the specific ache of watching a lesson he had taught land exactly the way he had hoped it never would have to. "I used to tell your class that the program built you for exactly one day like today. I did not expect to be the reason you got to prove it." "You're not the reason," Iris said. "You're the reason I knew where to look. That's different." "Is it?" Hale said, and did not push further because he recognized in the flatness of her answer The same deflection he had spent 6 years teaching her to deploy against her own instructors, whenever a compliment threatened to slow her down mid-exercise. Some habits, he understood, did not turn off just because the exercise was actually over. Across the hold, Thelk sat apart from the humans, near the small viewport at the aft bulkhead, watching the featureless gray smear of transit space with the stillness of a man who had spent the last 2 hours running the same calculation over and over, and arriving at the same unbearable answer each time. Iris left Hale beside Ray's and crossed to sit near him, not close, giving him the kind of distance a predator species instinctively read as respect rather than threat. "You're thinking about your family," she said. His slitted eyes flicked toward her, surprise breaking briefly through the careful stillness he had been holding since the apron. "How would you know that?" "Because it's what I'd be thinking about," Iris said. "You said the ministry would list you as a traitor within the hour. That doesn't just cost you a career. It costs everyone who shares your name." Thelk's tail curled slowly against the deck plating, the closest thing to a flinch his species allowed itself. "I have a mate on Corvin Reach, 2 clutch young, barely out of their first molt. The ministry's traitor designation extends to registered kin for 2 generations. My mate will lose Concord licensing for her trade guild within the week. My children will grow up listed in every registry that matters as the offspring of a defector." He was quiet for a long moment. "I did not think of them in the corridor when I opened that hatch. I have thought of nothing else since." "I'm sorry," Iris said, and meant it, because she had learned a long time ago that meaning it and being able to fix it were 2 entirely separate things, and that pretending otherwise did nobody any good. "I can't promise you the Concord treats you fairly after today. I can promise you that what we do with what you gave us, the records, the testimony, the fact that a magistrate broke rank rather than watch that program continue, will matter to more than just your career. Command doesn't leave that kind of leverage sitting unused." "Leverage," Thelk said, tasting the word. "For getting your family clear of Concord jurisdiction before the traitor designation reaches them," Iris said. "For making sure the ministry has more to lose from continuing a program a defecting magistrate is willing to testify against than it has to gain from finishing it. I'm not offering you comfort, magistrate. I don't have any to offer that would mean anything. I'm offering you the only thing I've got, which is that today wasn't wasted, and neither was what it's about to cost you." Thelk looked at her for a long moment, his black slitted eyes unreadable in the dim transit lighting, and something in his posture eased by a fraction too small for most species to register, though Iris, who had spent the last 6 hours learning to read exactly that kind of fraction on him, caught it clearly. "When I was young," he said, "my instructors taught that your species was proof the galaxy contained no justice worth trusting, that a world this lethal, producing a species this dangerous, could only mean the universe rewarded violence over reason. I have spent 40 years believing that, more or less without examining it, because examining beliefs that comfortable has never seemed necessary." He turned back to the viewport, to the gray nothing of transit space sliding past. "I no longer believe it. I am not certain yet what I believe instead, but I no longer believe that." "That's usually where it starts," Iris said. The forward station, when the Corvette finally dropped out of transit within its defensive perimeter, was nothing like the black basalt cathedral of the 9th Correction Vault, a squat, unglamorous ring of modular hab sections and docking arms orbiting a nondescript gray moon, the kind of installation built for function, rather than for making anyone who walked through it feel small. Iris had always found that contrast telling. The Concord built monuments to its own authority. Human forward stations were built to get the job done, and let the architecture worry about itself later. Colonel Revan Marsh met the ramp personally when it lowered into the station's receiving bay, which told Iris, before the woman said a single word, exactly how much weight this operation had carried up the chain. Marsh was in her 50s, silver threading through hair cropped short and practical, and she took in the scene on the ramp, 7 emaciated survivors, a wounded conquered magistrate in what remained of his ceremonial collar, and Iris standing at the center of it with a fresh dressing on her forearm and dried blood still crusted along her jaw from a graze she hadn't had time to notice getting, with the fast triage of a commander who had learned decades ago not to let her face show the full weight of what she was assessing. "Corporal Vance," Marsh said, "report." 8 of 9 Corvid survivors accounted for, Iris said. 1 confirmed deceased during Concord Research Procedures Specialist Price, 3 months prior to extraction. 7 recovered alive, medical priority for Corporal Reyes, and 2 others showing signs of prolonged malnutrition and procedural trauma. 1 Concord Ministry Compliance Director, Vex Sorrell, incapacitated and secured for transport, currently under Corvette medical restraint. 1 Concord Warden Magistrate, Voru Thelk, requesting asylum in exchange for testimony and full facility records regarding an unauthorized biological extraction program, designated proscribed research initiative, classification withheld pending your review. Marsh's expression did not change, but something in her stillness sharpened. "You brought back a ministry director." "He was leading a compliance squad sent to erase the evidence and the witnesses," Iris said. "Leaving him on that apron wasn't going to make the program disappear. Bringing him back means somebody in this chain of command finally gets to ask him questions with the truth on our side of the table instead of his." "That's not standard extraction doctrine, Corporal." "No, ma'am," Iris said. "Standard extraction doctrine didn't account for a magistrate deciding to help us get out either. I worked with what the mission gave me." Marsh held her gaze for a long moment, and Iris recognized, in the particular quality of that silence, an officer deciding whether the report in front of her represented brilliant improvisation or a chain of decisions someone would need to answer for later. She had seen that same calculation cross more than one commanding officer's face over 6 years of service, and had learned mostly not to flinch under it, because flinching read as guilt, and she had done nothing here that guilt belonged to. "Get your people to medical," Marsh said finally. "All of them. Then I want you in debrief in 2 hours, Corporal, and I want every detail, because what you just handed me is either the biggest intelligence coup this command has had in a decade or the biggest diplomatic incident, and right now I genuinely can't tell you which." "Might be both, ma'am," Iris said. "It usually is," Marsh said, and something in the corner of her mouth suggested briefly that she had meant it as something close to approval. The 2 hours that followed moved in the disjointed, efficient rhythm of a station machine, designed to process exactly this kind of arrival. Medics working through the freed prisoners with the calm thoroughness of people who had trained for trauma cases and were relieved for once to be treating survivors instead of casualties. Intelligence officers pulling Akafar aside within 20 minutes of her stepping off the ramp, because the power grid data she had spent 9 months memorizing from inside a cell turned out to be worth more to command than anyone had dared hope. A quiet, closed-door meeting between Marsh and 2 officers from a directorate whose insignia Iris did not immediately recognize. The kind of meeting that in her experience meant something had just gotten political fast. Sorrell, under restraint in the station's secure medical wing, said almost nothing during his initial processing beyond confirming his name and rank, and Iris, watching through the observation glass while a medic set the fractures along his lower ribs, found herself studying his stillness the way she had studied Thelk's in the corridor outside the lab, trying to read, in the set of 4 folded arms, and a face built for a species that did not show emotion the way humans did. Whether what she was looking at was a man calculating his next move or a man beginning, for the first time, to understand the size of the mistake his ministry had made. "He'll talk," Thelk said quietly, appearing at her shoulder in the observation corridor, still moving with the stiff caution of someone uncertain how much freedom his new circumstances actually afforded him. Not out of loyalty to you. Sorrel does not have loyalty in the shape your species means it. He will talk because he is, before anything else, a man who values being correct, and he has just watched every assumption in his research program proven wrong by a specimen who outthought him in his own facility. Men like that talk, eventually, because silence means admitting the wrongness sits unexamined, and that is worse to them than confession. You know him well, Iris said. I have served under his oversight for 11 months, Thelk said. I know exactly how little I understood him until today. The formal debrief ran long past the 2 hours Marsh had promised, stretching into a third, and then a fourth as intelligence officers worked through the recovered manifests. The facility schematics Iris had memorized weeks before ever setting foot on Ressa, and the sworn testimony Thelk gave without hesitation, in precise, procedural detail, describing 11 months of a research program he had spent most of that time telling himself was someone else's responsibility. Iris sat through most of it in a debrief room with gray walls and single narrow window looking out on the slow turn of the gray moon below, answering questions in the same flat, unhurried cadence she had used in the reclamation chamber, because the room did not need her calm to perform for anyone. It simply needed the facts, laid out in order, the way she had laid out everything else that day. You made the decision to get yourself captured without prior authorization from this command, said one of the unfamiliar insignia officers, a lean, humorless man named Director Aldi's Corps, whose directorate, Iris had gathered by then, handled matters the regular chain of command preferred not to have its fingerprints on. Walk me through the reasoning. Standard extraction protocols assume the target facility can be approached covertly, Iris said. The 9th Correction Vault's perimeter security made covert entry statistically unlikely to succeed without triggering the exact lockdown response that would have gotten every prisoner inside killed before extraction. Getting arrested put me inside the perimeter with full institutional cooperation instead of against it. It was the approach vector with the highest probability of getting 8 people out alive. 7, as it turned out. That's a significant risk to accept unilaterally, Corporal. Sir, with respect, Iris said, I've spent 6 years training for exactly the kind of risk that made this operation possible. If I'd waited for an authorization chain that didn't understand the specific math of what I was walking into, Corporal Reyes doesn't survive whatever the 9th extraction procedure was going to be. I made the call I was trained to make. I'll stand behind it in whatever review this command decides to run. Corps studied her for a long moment, the particular flat scrutiny of a man whose entire career ran on assessing whether an asset's unpredictability was a liability or an advantage, and Iris held his gaze without expression, because she had made peace with the arithmetic of that decision long before the Corvette ever left dock 11 weeks ago, and no debrief room was going to talk her out of math she had already run correctly. For what it's worth, Corps said finally, closing the folder in front of him, the conquered Ministry of Biological Assets has an oversight committee that answers, ultimately, to a civilian council that does not know this research program existed and would very much prefer it stay that way once they find out how it looked from the outside. A defecting magistrate's sworn testimony, backed by facility manifests, backed by 7 living witnesses who can describe exactly what was done to them. That is not intelligence, Corporal. That is leverage large enough to shut the entire program down without this command firing a single additional shot. You didn't just get 8 people out of a cell. You handed this directorate the exact tool it needed to make sure nobody else's cell gets built. 7, Iris said, quiet, correcting him without heat, because the number mattered and she did not intend to let it round itself down out of convenience. Price didn't make it out. Corps held her gaze a beat longer, and something in his flat professional composure shifted, a small concession to a correction he understood was not administrative. 7, he said, noted for the record, Corporal. And for whatever it is worth from someone in my position, I am sorry for the 8th. It was, Iris thought, the first time all day anyone from the ministry side or her own chain of command had said those words to her without her having to extract them first. And she found the smallness of that fact settling into her the way most costs did, acknowledged, real, and set aside in the quiet place she had been carrying it since the moment Hale told her Price's name in the corridor outside the cells. Sorrel gave his first full statement 4 days later, once the fractures along his lower ribs had knitted enough to let him sit upright without a support brace, and Iris watched it from the observation side of the interview glass, because Marsh had, without much ceremony, decided the operative who had put him there had earned the right to see how it ended. He did not confess out of remorse. Thelk had been right about that. He confessed the way a scholar corrects a flawed theorem, methodically, precisely, with the faint clinical irritation of a man annoyed less by the harm his work had caused than by the fact that his conclusions had turned out to be wrong. The program's founding premise was incorrect, he said, to the 2 intelligence officers running the interview, his 4 hands folded in the same resting posture he had worn on the transport apron, though the confidence behind it had thinned considerably. We assumed Tier 9 survival capacity was primarily biochemical, extractable, transferable, a set of proteins and neural adaptations that could be isolated and administered to a different physiology. Subject 7's extraction data does not support that conclusion. The variable we failed to account for was not chemical, it was behavioral, trained. A discipline of mind that a body cannot simply be made to inherit through procedure, regardless of how precisely the procedure is executed. You're saying the thing that makes them dangerous isn't in the blood, one of the officers said. I am saying, Sorrel said, that the ministry spent 11 months and considerable resources attempting to bottle a trait that has never, in the entire history of the specimen species, existed anywhere except inside a mind that chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to build it. We were looking for a serum. We should have been looking at what her instructors taught her. A pause, and something in his flat clinical voice thinned toward an admission he clearly found distasteful to make. It would not have made a difference to my recommendations at the time, but it is, I will concede, the more accurate finding. Sorrel himself was quietly stripped of his ministry directorship within the month, reassigned to an archival post on a records world so far from any active border that Corps' directorate stopped tracking his movements entirely within the year, satisfied that a scholar who valued being correct above all else had been placed exactly where his remaining usefulness could do the least additional harm. Iris never spoke to him again after the interview room, and did not particularly want to. She had taken what mattered from that encounter on the transport apron on Ressa. In the 90 seconds it had taken to put him on the ground, and nothing he said afterward, however precise, changed the arithmetic of that day. The statement, delivered with a scholar's dry precision and a magistrate's sworn corroboration, moved through the Concord's oversight structures faster than Corps' directorate had dared hope. Within 3 weeks, a civilian council that had never known the 9th Correction Vault's research wing existed ordered it dissolved, its remaining staff reassigned, its records sealed, and more usefully, quietly shared in redacted form with the very human command that had exposed it, in the kind of careful diplomatic gesture a government makes when it wants a problem to look resolved without admitting how badly it had been mishandled. Voru Thelk's traitor designation was formally rescinded, not out of gratitude, Corps told Iris flatly when the news came through, but because a council trying to close a scandal quietly had no interest in a defecting magistrate's trial becoming a second, larger scandal about what, exactly, he had defected from. His mate and Clutchyoung were granted transit clearance off Corvin Reach within the month, and Iris was in the station's receiving bay, 6 weeks after the corvette first touched down there, when Thelk met them at the docking arm, 2 small Osheran children who had not seen their father in what was, for their species, a considerable fraction of their short lives, crossing the deck at a dead run the moment they cleared the gate. and a magistrate who had spent 40 years cultivating a professional stillness that broke completely, without apology, the instant they reached him. Iris watched from a respectful distance and did not intrude on it. She had learned, over 6 years of service, that some costs, once paid, deserved to be witnessed only by the people who had actually paid them. Ray's recovery was slower and less clean. The medical staff at the forward station could stabilize what the extraction procedures had done to him, could manage the tremors in his altered forearms with a course of nerve-regulating treatment that dulled them to something closer to a persistent ache than a constant fight for control. But they could not undo 11 weeks of what his body had become, and Iris understood. The first time she sat with him in the station's rehabilitation wing 3 weeks after the extraction. That undoing had never actually been on the table. "They keep asking if I want reconstructive treatment," he said, flexing his right hand slowly, watching the corded, wrong-angled muscle shift beneath skin that still carried a faint mineral sheen at the wrist. "Cosmetic stuff mostly. Make it look more like it used to. I keep telling them no." "Why?" Iris asked, because she had learned from Hale, a long time ago, that the honest question mattered more than the comfortable one. "Because it's mine," Ray said after a moment. "Whatever they did to me in that lab, it's still my body that came out the other side of it, made it out, made it home. I don't want to erase the part of the record that says that happened. I just want to get strong enough that it stops feeling like something that was done to me and starts feeling like something I carry." He looked up at her, and something steadier than she had seen from him yet settled into his expression. "You didn't ask me if I wanted rescuing, back in that lab. You just started pulling the leads." "There wasn't time to ask," Iris said, "and I already knew the answer." "Yeah," Ray said quiet, "I know you did." Hale's own recovery ran a different course, less visible, mostly a matter of weight regained and color returning to skin that 9 months of confinement had left gray and thin. He requested formal separation from active service 6 weeks after the extraction, a decision that surprised no one who had watched him in the debrief sessions. A man who had spent 30 years running exactly the kind of operations his student had just executed alone, and who had come out of 9 months in a conquered cell with a clarity about the shape of the rest of his life that made the decision, once he reached it, feel less like a retirement and more like a debt finally settled. "I'll teach," he told Iris, the last evening before his transport home departed, the two of them standing on the station's observation deck watching the gray moon slow turn below. "Not field work. I'm done with field work. But somebody's got to keep training the next round of instructors who will train the next round of operators, and I've got 30 years of notes on what actually works and what just looks good in a classroom. Figure I owe the program that much at least." "You already gave it plenty," Iris said. "I gave it a curriculum," Hale said. "You're the one who proved the curriculum was right. There's a difference, Vance, and don't let anyone talk you into thinking there isn't." He was quiet for a moment, watching the moon's slow arc through the observation window. "You know what the hardest part of that program was? When I was teaching it to you and 18 other terrified 19-year-olds who'd never been in a real fight in their lives. It wasn't the physical conditioning. Bodies adapt to almost anything you ask of them, given enough time and the right instruction. The hardest part was convincing a room full of kids that staying calm wasn't the same thing as not caring, that you could walk into a room where every instinct your body owned was screaming at you to run or fight or freeze, and choose something quieter than all three, and that the quiet was not the absence of everything you felt. It was the discipline of not letting what you felt make the decision for you." "I remember," Iris said. "I know you do," Hale said. "I watched the debrief footage from the corridor outside that lab. 26 minutes into the worst day of your professional life, and your pulse was steadier than mine is right now, standing here on a station with nothing shooting at either of us." He looked at her, and the pride in his face was unguarded now, none of the deflection either of them usually favored. "I've trained a lot of good operators, Vance. I want you to hear me say plainly that what you did on Ressa wasn't good. It was the finest thing I have ever watched a soldier do, and I have been doing this job since before you were born." Iris did not have a ready answer for that. She had trained herself over 6 years to deflect praise the same reflexive way she deflected pain, setting it aside in the part of her mind that handled things too large to process mid-operation. Except the operation was over now, and there was nowhere left to set it. And for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she let herself simply stand in it. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, quiet, and meant every syllable of it. Priya Akafar's contribution earned its own quiet recognition, though she seemed, when Corps' directorate tried to formalize a commendation for it, mostly bemused by the fuss. 9 months of confinement had given her nothing to do but watch, and she had spent that time doing the one thing her training as a systems engineer had left her incapable of turning off: mapping, from behind reinforced glass, the power routing, the backup conduits, the maintenance cycles of a facility that had never once considered a prisoner might be paying that kind of attention. "I wasn't being brave," she told Iris, the two of them sharing a meal in the station's mess hall a week before Akafar's own transport home departed. "I was bored and scared, and it turned out the only thing that kept the scared from winning some days was giving my brain a problem to chew on that wasn't the problem sitting right in front of me. Didn't think any of it would matter. Figured I'd die in there with a very detailed and completely useless map of a building nobody would ever let me leave." "It mattered," Iris said. "The Ministry Oversight Committee shut the program down inside 3 weeks partly because your grid data corroborated the timeline in Thelk's testimony down to the hour. That's not nothing." "Funny thing to have proven, though," Akafar said, pushing a piece of bread around her tray without eating it. "That the most dangerous thing in that whole facility wasn't the woman who broke 8 enforcers with her bare hands. It was a bored engineer with nothing to do but pay attention. Nobody designs a prison to survive an inmate who refuses to stop being useful." "Most people don't," Iris said. "Most people design a prison to survive the inmate they're afraid of. Nobody ever plans for the one they underestimated." She considered the bread, then Akafar's tired, steady face, and found in it the same quiet discipline she had spent a year now teaching cadets half Akafar's age to build on purpose. "You didn't need 6 years of training to hold that line. You just held it anyway, because it was the only thing left in that cell that was actually yours to control." Akafar didn't have an answer for that beyond a small, tired smile, and the two of them finished the meal mostly in comfortable silence, the particular silence of two people who had both, in their own way, refused to let a locked door decide who they were. "No," Akafar agreed after a moment, something quietly steady settling into her expression. "I suppose it isn't." Enforcer Prime Kes Ithra's story reached Iris secondhand, months later, through a diplomatic backchannel Corps' directorate maintained with the handful of conquered officers who had quietly begun, in the aftermath of the 9th correction, Vault's dissolution, asking harder questions about programs they had once simply followed orders to secure. Ithra had not defected. Her species did not carry the same concept of individual conscience overriding institutional loyalty that had driven Thelk's decision on the transport apron, and Iris did not fault her for that, because 6 years of operational work had taught her that courage looked different shaped by different biology. But she had requested transfer away from Correction Vault security duty entirely, citing, in the flat clinical language of a formal conquered personnel filing, operational concerns regarding facility mission scope, and had taken a post instead training new enforcement cadets in a curriculum that, according to the same backchannel, had quietly begun including a new unit on de-escalation protocol that had never existed in Korath enforcement doctrine before. It was not redemption, exactly. Iris did not think in terms that clean. But it was a small, specific correction made by someone who had stood in a corridor with 11 weapons raised at 7 unarmed people, and had chosen, in that moment, to lower hers a fraction before anyone told her to. And Iris had learned a long time ago not to discount the value of small corrections simply because they arrived without ceremony. The months that followed settled into a rhythm Iris had not expected to find herself missing quite as much as she did once it ended. Debriefs gave way to reviews. Reviews gave way to a formal commendation she accepted with the same flat efficiency she brought to everything else. And eventually, 4 months after the Corvette first touched down at the forward station with 14 people aboard who had not expected to see open sky again, Command reassigned her, not back to field extraction work, not yet, but to the same unremarkable facility, off no public record, where Aldous Hale had once taught a room full of terrified 19-year-olds that calm was not the same thing as not caring. She had not asked for the posting. She suspected, though nobody confirmed it directly, that Hale had. The facility sat at the end of a gravel road on a stretch of coastline nobody who wasn't looking for it would ever find by accident. A low complex of converted warehouses and a training yard ringed by pine trees that turned the wind into a constant low murmur, no matter the season. Iris arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in early autumn, duffel over one shoulder, and found Hale waiting for her at the gate with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 30 years building something and had finally found someone he trusted to help him keep building it. "Cadre of 19 this cycle," he said, walking her through the yard toward the main hall. "Youngest just turned 19. Oldest is 34, came over from conventional infantry, thinks that means something in here. It doesn't, not the way he expects, and he's going to find that out the hard way sometime in the next 6 weeks unless somebody straightens him out first." A glance at her, sighed Long. "Figured you might have some thoughts on how to do that." "I might," Iris said. The cadre assembled in the main hall's classroom that afternoon, 19 faces ranging from raw nerves to studied bravado, and Iris stood at the front of the room the way Hale once had, and did not open with a lecture about technique, because she had learned, on a black basalt floor 40 feet beneath a domed glass ceiling, that technique was never the thing that mattered first. "6 months ago," she said, "I was strapped into a restraint frame on an alien world, sentenced to die in front of 200 witnesses who expected me to be afraid. I want you to understand something before we start any of the physical work in this program. The reason I walked out of that chamber wasn't strength. It wasn't speed. Every one of you will meet something out there stronger and faster than you are, and if strength and speed were the whole answer, none of us would ever come home." She let that sit a moment, watching it land across 19 young faces in 19 different ways. "The reason I walked out was that my heart rate never left 51 beats a minute, from the moment they closed the cuffs to the moment I walked back out under open sky. That's not a gift. Nobody's born with that number. It's a discipline, built one uncomfortable rep at a time, and it is the only thing in this entire program that will still be working for you after every weapon you're carrying has run out of ammunition, and every plan you walked in with has fallen apart." A hand went up near the back. The 34-year-old Hale had mentioned, Iris guessed, before she even called on him, something in the set of his jaw already braced for an argument. "With respect," he said, "I've done 2 combat tour. I know what staying calm under fire looks like." "You know what staying calm under fire that ends in under a minute looks like," Iris said. "This program isn't building you for a firefight. It's building you for the kind of situation where the fight is the easy part, and the actual test is what you do in the 26 minutes before it, when everyone around you is certain you've already lost, and the only weapon you've got left is your own pulse." The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the pines, the same low, constant murmur it had carried since before any of them arrived, and would carry long after they'd all moved on to whatever came next. "I'm not telling you this to impress you," Iris said. "I'm telling you because in 6 weeks, some of you are going to be in a room that decides you're smaller than the problem in front of you. I need you walking out of that room with a lower number than the room expects. Everything else we can teach. That part you have to choose over and over until it stops being a choice and starts being who you are. Vorothelk visited the facility twice that first year, both times in his new capacity as a liaison attached to Corps' directorate. An arrangement command had built specifically for him. Once it became clear that a former conquered magistrate with 11 months of direct oversight experience inside a research vault was worth considerably more as an ongoing advisor than as a one-time witness whose testimony had already been extracted and filed. He arrived the second time in early spring, when the pines along the training yard had gone thick with new growth, and found Iris on the observation platform overlooking a live exercise, watching 19 cadets who had thinned by 3 since Autumn worked through a scenario she had designed herself. "They are running the restraint drill," Thelk observed, joining her at the rail. "I recognize the shape of it. You have built your own reclamation chamber." "A version of it," Iris said. "Nobody dies in this one. But the fear's got to be real for the discipline to mean anything. So we make the rest of it as close to real as we can manage without the actual stakes." Below them in the yard, a young woman 19, the youngest of the cadre, a slight quiet cadet named Delphine Akoro, who had barely spoken in the classroom all winter, stood strapped into a mock restraint frame, while 2 instructors in role-play gear circled her, shouting the kind of theatrical threats Iris had once heard delivered, without theater, in a chamber 40 light-years from anywhere she'd ever call home. Akoro's face, even from the observation platform, showed the particular stillness of someone working hard to hold a line she was not yet certain she owned. "She's going to make it," Iris said, watching. "Give her another minute. She's already found the count." "You can tell that from here." "I can tell that because I remember exactly what it looked like on my own face the first time I found it," Iris said. "Took me 4 months of trying before it worked under real pressure instead of just in the classroom. She's ahead of where I was at this stage." They watched in silence for a while, the wind moving through the pines, the shouted drills below rising and falling in their scripted rhythm, and Thelk, after a time, spoke again, quieter. "My clutch young ask about you," he said. "My daughter, the elder one, she is old enough now to understand in outline what happened on Ressa. She has decided, in the manner of children everywhere, that you are the reason her father did not disappear from her life the way the ministry intended. I have not corrected her. I am not certain the correction would be entirely honest." "You made the decision that mattered," Iris said. "I just opened a door." "You opened a door I did not know existed," Thelk said. "There is a difference, Deathworlder, and I have had a year now to sit with exactly how large it is." He looked out over the training yard. At 19, soon to be 16, young humans learning to build, deliberately and at considerable cost, the exact discipline that had once made his entire species certain theirs was the only kind of strength worth fearing. "I spent 40 years believing your species was proof the universe rewarded violence over reason. I have spent this last year learning that what I actually witnessed, on the worst day of my career, was proof the universe sometimes rewards patience over cruelty, and that the two are not the same lesson at all." Below, Delphine Akoro's shoulders eased by a fraction too small for the instructors circling her to notice, and her pulse, Iris didn't need the exercise's monitoring feed to know it, could read it in the set of the girl's jaw the same way Hale had once read a dislocated thumb from across a debrief room, settled and held. Devin Reyes came to the facility in late summer, a year and 2 months after a woman with a stolen sidearm and a memorized deck plan had pulled the last extraction lead from his arm in a cold research lab 400 light-years from anywhere he had ever called home. He did not come as a patient. He came in a set of field fatigues that had been tailored, quietly, to accommodate forearms that would never again match a standard-issue sleeve, and he found Iris in the equipment shed running maintenance checks on the restraint frame's monitoring rig. a task she still did herself rather than delegate, because she had learned a long time ago that the small mechanical work of a program mattered as much as the philosophy of it. "Command cleared me for instructor duty," he said, standing in the doorway with something that was not quite nervousness and not quite pride. "Physical conditioning track. Figured if anybody's qualified to teach a room full of cadets what a body can still do after it's been rebuilt by people who didn't ask permission, it's me." Iris set down the diagnostic tool and looked at him for a long moment, at the mineral sheen still faintly visible at his temples, at the corded wrong-angled strength in forearms he had chosen, a year ago in a rehabilitation wing, not to erase, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for, some quiet cousin of the satisfaction she had felt watching Delphine Okoro's shoulders ease in the training yard. "Hale's going to work you hard," she said. "He doesn't go easy on anybody who thinks a war record earns them a shortcut." "Good," Reyes said. "I'm done with shortcuts. Spent 4 weeks on a table finding out what happens when somebody else decides what my body's allowed to become. I'd like to spend a while deciding that myself, for a change, and figure teaching other people how to hold their own line while they do it is about as good a way to spend that while as any." "Then welcome to the cadre," Iris said, and meant it the way she meant most things now, plainly, without ceremony, the words doing exactly the work they needed to do and nothing more. "Can I ask you something?" Reyes said, after a moment, leaning against the doorframe with the careful posture of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much weight his rebuilt frame could take before something protested. "Back in the lab, you didn't hesitate, didn't check with anyone, didn't wait for a medic, just started pulling leads out of my arm like you'd done it 100 times before. I've thought about that a lot this past year. How you knew that fast that it was safe to move me." "I didn't know it was safe," Iris said. "I knew that leaving you on that table was guaranteed to end badly, and moving you was only probably going to end badly, and probably beats guaranteed every time the clock's running against you. That's not confidence, Reyes. That's just the math you run when you don't have time to run a better one." "Doesn't feel like just math from where I was lying," Reyes said. "It rarely does from that side of the table," Iris said. "That's sort of the point of training it until it's automatic. The people you're moving for don't need to feel the arithmetic. They just need it to have already been done correctly by the time it reaches them." Reyes considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, something in his expression settling the way Iris had watched a great many expressions settle over the past year. Not resolution exactly, but the particular piece of a question that had finally gotten an honest answer instead of a comfortable one. He stayed to help her finish the diagnostic on the restraint frame, the two of them working in companionable quiet as the light outside the shed's single window went long and gold with early evening, and it occurred to Iris, watching his altered hands move with careful precision over a panel of wiring, that this, the unglamorous maintenance of a program built to keep training the next generation of people who might one day be strapped into a chamber somewhere and need the discipline to survive it, was its own kind of ending, the quiet, unremarkable, entirely earned kind that never made it into any conquered archive and did not need to. The news reached the facility through the same diplomatic back channel that had carried word of Ithra's transfer, delivered this time by Kor himself on one of his infrequent visits, standing at the edge of the training yard, with the flat, unhurried satisfaction of a man reporting a return on an investment he had made without being entirely certain, at the time, that it would pay out. "Border incident 3 weeks ago," he said, watching the cadre run drills below. "Different sector, different species entirely, a trade consortium out past the frontier, not conquered at all, but word travels between administrations faster than any of them like to admit. Local enforcement detained a human survey team on a trespass charge, the kind of thing that would have ended in a research vault a year and a half ago without anyone back home hearing about it until it was too late to matter. This time, the detaining officer pulled the file on a certain 9th correction vault before deciding how far to take it, Released the survey team within 6 hours. Formal apology through proper channels within the week. Because of Sorrel's confession, Iris said. Because of yours, Kor said. Sorrel's confession told the conquered civilian council what one ministry director had done wrong. What's traveling through every border administration within 100 light-years of humanity's territory now isn't a confession, Corporal. It's a story. About a species that got underestimated by a facility with 11,000 successful dissolutions on its record, and paid for the underestimating in about 26 minutes. Stories like that don't stay contained to the government that generated them. They travel. And administrations that hear them start asking themselves, before they reach for a restraint frame, whether they've actually done the math on what they're about to detain. Iris considered that for a long moment, watching Delphine Akoro, 6 weeks from graduation now, steadier every time Iris watched her work, move through a takedown sequence with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had finally stopped needing to think about the count and simply carried it, the way a heartbeat carries itself once a body has learned to trust it. That wasn't the plan, she said finally. I went to Ressa for 8 people, 7 in the end. Most of the plans that end up mattering most weren't the plan, Kor said. You went in to bring people home. What you actually did was make it a little more expensive, across a fair stretch of this side of the galaxy, for anyone who assumes calm means weak. He was quiet a moment, watching the drills. I don't imagine that was the mission you signed up to run. I do imagine it's not a bad thing to have done, all the same. Graduation for the autumn cadre came on a bright, cold morning in late October. The kind of clear northern light that turned the training yards frost-touched grass silver at the edges, and made the pines along the perimeter stand out sharp against a pale sky. 16 of the original 19 stood in formation on the yard's packed earth, in fatigues that had been broken improperly now, faces that had lost the raw uncertainty of the previous autumn, and replaced it with something quieter, harder one. The particular steadiness Iris had spent a year building into them, one uncomfortable rep at a time. Hale gave the formal address, because some traditions in this program predated Iris and would outlast her, and she stood near the back of the small assembled crowd, instructors, a handful of command liaisons including Kor, and standing a little apart in a long civilian coat that did nothing to disguise the careful stillness of 40 years military bearing, Varu Thelk, who had requested leave to attend and been granted it without much debate. Given how directly his own testimony had shaped the curriculum, these 16 graduates had just survived. A year ago, Hale told the formation, his voice carrying clean across the yard in the cold morning air, most of you walked through that gate certain that strength meant never being afraid. I want you to leave through it today knowing something truer, because it's the only thing in this program that will still be working for you long after every other lesson we've taught you has been tested, and some of it has failed. Strength was never the absence of fear. It is the discipline of not letting fear write the next line for you. Every one of you has proven in the last 12 months that you can hold that discipline under pressure this program built specifically to break it. Somewhere out there, sooner than any of you would like, something considerably less controlled than this training yard is going to test it again. I have every confidence you will hold. When the formation broke, Delphine Akoro found Iris near the equipment shed, and stood for a moment in the particular hesitation of a graduate who has one more thing to say, and has not yet decided whether saying it will sound foolish. You told us that first day, Akoro said, about the chamber, the frame, 51 beats a minute for 26 minutes. She paused. I looked up the record afterward. There isn't one. Not publicly anyway. Whatever happened on that world, it's classified past anything a cadet can access. It is, Iris said. So I've spent a year training against a number I couldn't verify, Akoro said. Not quite an accusation, more a genuine question working its way out from under a year of discipline that had taught her not to ask things carelessly. You spent a year training against a standard, Iris said. Whether you could verify the exact number or not was never the point. The point was building the same discipline in yourself until it stopped being someone else's story and became something you owned outright. She studied the younger woman for a moment, steadier now than the frightened 19-year-old who'd stood in the mock restraint frame the previous spring, carrying something in her posture that had not been there a year ago and would, Iris suspected, only deepen with time and use. You want to know if it's true? Yes, Akoro admitted. Iris held her gaze and let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The same unhurried patience she had once used on a conquered magistrate who had asked her, in a chamber built to end her life, whether she understood the sentence. It's true, she said. Every second of it. I'll tell you the same thing I told the room that day because it's the only answer that's ever mattered in this program. It wasn't a gift. It was a discipline, built one uncomfortable rep at a time, exactly like the ones you've spent a year running in this yard. You have the same tools I had. What you do with them from here is the only part of the story that's actually yours to write. Akoro nodded slowly, something settling into her expression that looked, to Iris, very much like a young woman deciding, deliberately and for herself, which kind of soldier she intended to become. She saluted, the crisp formal gesture the program required at the close of every cadre cycle, and Iris returned it, and watched her walk back toward the formation to collect her transfer orders. One more graduate carrying a standard forward that had been built, originally, by a room full of terrified 19-year-olds, none of whom had known, at the time, how far the discipline they were learning would eventually travel. Thelk found her afterward, at the edge of the yard, where the frost had not yet burned off in the shadow of the pines. And for a while, the two of them simply stood together, watching the graduates load their gear into the transports that would scatter them across a dozen forward postings none of them would speak of again outside a classified debrief room. I return to my post tomorrow, Thelk said. The liaison work suits me better than I expected it to. 40 years of reading conquered procedure from the inside turns out to be useful for explaining, in language your command actually trusts, exactly which of our institutional habits are worth watching for, and which are simply theater. I did not imagine, this time last year, that I would find purpose in helping the species that ended my career. I have stopped being surprised by how often that turns out to be true. How's your family? Iris asked. Settling, Thelk said. My mate has found work with a trade concern that does not ask uncomfortable questions about the trader designation, now formally rescinded but not, I think, formally forgotten by everyone who once believed in it. My elder daughter has decided she wishes to study xenobiology when she is old enough. I have not discouraged her, though I confess the irony of that ambition, given how I spent the last year of my previous career, is not lost on me. He was quiet a moment, watching the transports pull away one by one down the gravel road. She asked me once, my daughter, why I opened that hatch, why I chose the corridor over the career I had spent 40 years building. I did not have a clean answer for her at the time. I believe I do now. What did you tell her? That there is a difference, Thelk said, between a species that is dangerous because it hates you and a species that is dangerous because it has simply decided, calmly and completely, what it will and will not permit to be done in front of it. My entire career I was taught to fear the first kind. Nobody ever prepared me for the second, and I do not think, looking back across everything I have learned this past year, that anyone could have. Some lessons only arrive the hard way, strapped into whatever chamber life decides to teach them in. Iris considered that, watching the last of the frost burn away under a climbing sun, the pines standing dark and steady against a sky gone fully clear now, the training yard behind them empty and quiet for the first time in a year, waiting for the next cadre, the next uncertain 19-year-old who would need, eventually, to learn the same discipline the yard had already taught 16 others, and would go on teaching long after everyone standing in it today had moved on to whatever came next. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you'd have made the same choice even if none of this happened. You just needed the corridor to prove it to yourself." Thelk's slitted eyes settled on her, and something in his posture, the careful, deliberate stillness of a species that had spent millennia learning to read threat in every unguarded motion, eased into something Iris had come to recognize over the last year, as close to warmth as his physiology allowed. "Perhaps," he said, "I find I no longer need to know for certain. It is enough that I made it, and that I would make it again." He left the following morning, and Iris did not see him again for the better part of a year after that, though word reached her occasionally, through the same quiet channels that carried most of what mattered from that side of the border. A ministry oversight reform here. A border incident resolved through patience rather than force there. Small corrections accumulating the way small corrections always did, unglamorous, mostly unrecorded, and in their slow accumulation, the only kind of change that ever actually held. The spring cadre arrived on a wet gray morning 18 months after a restraint frame had closed over Iris Vance's wrists on a world she had not thought about. By then, more than a handful of times in the preceding month, not because the memory had faded, but because it had settled, finally, into the same quiet category as everything else the work had cost her. Acknowledged, carried, and no longer the loudest thing in the room. 21 names on the roster this time, the largest cadre the program had run in 3 years. A fact core attributed without much subtlety to the quiet spread of a story that traveled faster and further than any recruitment poster ever managed to. Iris met them in the same classroom Hale had once used to teach her, standing at the front of the room while 21 faces ranging from raw nerve to studied bravado settled into the same uneven rows every cadre before them had filled. She did not open with the restraint frame story this time. She had learned over 3 cycles of teaching that leading with the hardest lesson too early sometimes taught the wrong version of it, awe instead of discipline, a myth instead of a method. Instead, she opened the way she had learned slowly was actually the more honest place to start. "Some of you are here because you think this program will make you fearless," she said. "It won't. I want that clear before we do a single rep of physical conditioning. Fear is not the thing we're training out of you. Fear is data. It tells you something matters. What we are training is what you do with that data once it arrives, whether you let it choose your next move, or whether you choose it yourself calmly, on purpose, even when every instinct in your body is screaming that calm is the wrong answer." She looked out over the room, at 21 people who had not yet learned to hold her gaze without flinching, and felt, not for the first time, the particular weight of standing exactly where Hale had once stood, carrying forward a discipline that had outlived every reason anyone had first built it. "By the time you leave this yard, some of you are going to be very good at that. A few of you are going to be exceptional at it. All of you are going to be tested on it, somewhere out there, in circumstances none of us in this room can predict today. I can't promise you'll walk out of whatever room that turns out to be. I can promise you that the discipline you build here will still be working for you long after everything else you're carrying has run out." A hand went up near the front this time, a young man barely out of his teens with the particular earnestness of someone who had not yet learned when a question could wait. "Is it true," he asked, "what they say happened to you, the execution chamber? The 11,000 others before you?" Iris looked at him for a long moment and thought briefly of a black basalt room 40 feet beneath a domed glass ceiling, of a magistrate who had spent 40 years certain his species' authority was the only kind worth trusting, of a corridor full of malnourished survivors who had been listed as dead for 9 months and had walked, on their own legs, into open daylight anyway. "It's true," she said, "every part of it, but I'd rather you spend the next 6 weeks worrying less about what happened to me on that world and more about what you're building in yourself right here in this yard, 1 rep at a time." That's the only part of the story that was ever actually about you." The room settled into the particular attentive quiet that told her, better than any roster number could, that the lesson had landed exactly where it needed to. Outside, through the classroom's single window, the wind moved through the pines in the same low, constant murmur it had carried for as long as she had been coming to this place, steady, patient, indifferent to whatever came next. And Iris found, standing at the front of a room full of frightened, hopeful faces who had not yet learned what their own pulse could do for them under pressure, that she did not need to check her own to know it was holding, quiet and even, exactly where she had trained it to be. Some rooms were built to make you smaller. She had spent 6 years, and one very long afternoon on a world called Ressa, learning that the size of the room never actually mattered. What mattered was the one number nobody outside could see, the one no restraint cuff, no dissolution coil, no 11,000 prior sentences could touch. And as she watched 21 new faces begin, however unevenly, to understand that for themselves, Iris Vance allowed herself, quietly and without ceremony, the small, earned satisfaction of a discipline that had already outlasted everyone who had ever bet against it. Word came back about Delphine Akoro 11 months later, through the same quiet command channel that carried most of what mattered from operators already deployed. She had been posted to a forward listening station near a contested border, and during a routine perimeter survey her 3-person team had been detained by a local militia that mistook a downed comms relay for an act of aggression, rather than the equipment failure it actually was. The report Iris eventually read, stripped down to the flat procedural language command favored for these things, described 6 hours of detention, a hostile interrogation conducted by men who expected fear and grew increasingly unsettled by its absence, and a young officer who had kept her voice level, her hands still, and her 2 teammates calm enough that, when the militia commander finally realized his mistake, he released all 3 without incident, and without anyone on either side pulling a trigger. She held 58 beats a minute for the whole 6 hours, Hale told Iris, reading from the same report over coffee in the equipment shed, something unmistakably proud working at the corner of his mouth. Debrief officer flagged it because it was the calmest sustained reading he'd seen logged on a first deployment in longer than he could remember. Wanted a note added to the training file explaining how a rookie held that kind of number under 6 hours of hostile interrogation. "What'd you tell him?" Iris asked. "Told him the truth," Hale said. "Told him we've got a program that builds exactly that, one uncomfortable rep at a time, and that the operator who wrote the manual on it happened to be standing right here if he wanted the details." He set the report down, and for a moment the pride in his weathered face gave way to something quieter, more settled. She didn't need to break anything to get her team home, Vance. Didn't need to hurt anyone, didn't need luck, didn't need a bigger weapon than the ones already pointed at her. She just held the line long enough for the people across the table to run out of reasons to keep pointing it. That's the whole program, distilled down to 6 hours in a field report. That's what you built here. "What we built," Iris said. "Semantics," Hale said, but he was smiling when he said it, and neither of them corrected the word again. There was one more piece of the record Iris kept, separate from the commendations and the classified debrief files, and the training curriculum that carried her name now alongside Hale's in the program's quiet internal history. It was small, and it did not appear in any command archive, because command archives were not built to hold the kind of thing it was. Specialist Renata Price had been 26 years old, a communications officer aboard the Corvid, engaged to be married the following spring to a man who had waited 9 months for news that never came the way he needed it to, and had finally received, 4 months after the extraction, the confirmation his own patience had earned him. Not the rescue he had spent those months hoping for, but the truth, delivered by Iris herself in person. Because she had decided early on that a fact this heavy did not belong in a form letter. She had found him at his apartment on a coastal town 2 hours from the facility, A small, quiet man with tired eyes who had opened the door already half expecting, from the careful way command had scheduled the visit, that whatever news had finally traveled the 400 light-years back to him would not be the news he had spent 9 months praying for. "Tell me all of it," he had said, once she was seated across from him at a kitchen table cluttered with the small, ordinary debris of a life someone had kept moving forward through, out of necessity, while waiting for an answer. "Don't soften it." She wouldn't have wanted it softened. Iris had told him all of it, the manifests, the research designation, the 3 months of testing that Price had endured before her body simply could not carry the procedure any further, the fact that her death had been the specific, documented catalyst that convinced the remaining survivors to trust extraction protocols enough to cooperate quickly when the moment finally came, months later, that someone was actually in the building to get them out. It was not comfort. Iris did not believe, by then, in comfort dressed up as a kinder version of the truth. But it was, she had learned from Hale a long time ago, the only form of respect a fact that Heavy actually deserved. She'd have liked knowing that, he said finally, quiet, turning a small photograph over in his hands, the only comfort in the room he seemed to actually trust. That it mattered. That it wasn't just he stopped and did not finish the sentence and did not need to. "It mattered," Iris said. "I made sure the record says so. Not 7 survivors, Mr. Ferris. 8. 7 who walked out under their own power, and one whose name is written into every version of that record as the reason the other 7 made it as far as they did." He had nodded slowly and set the photograph down, and Iris had sat with him a while longer, past the point where the operational purpose of the visit had been served, because some debts were not the kind that closed the moment the paperwork did. Ferris wrote to her twice after that, brief letters that arrived by ordinary civilian mail rather than any command channel, and in the second one, nearly a year after the visit, he mentioned almost in passing that he had applied for a civilian liaison position with the same directorate that had run the extraction, not field work. Nothing close to it, just records management. The quiet, unglamorous work of making sure names like Price's stayed correctly attached to the facts of what had happened to them, instead of dissolving into the kind of bloodless institutional language that let governments forget their own mistakes at convenient intervals. Iris wrote back a single line. That seemed like exactly the kind of debt worth spending a career on. She did not hear from him again for a long while after that, and took the silence correctly, as a man finally finding steadier ground to stand on. She thought of that kitchen table sometimes, standing at the front of a new cadre's first classroom session, watching frightened 19-year-olds learn a discipline that would, for most of them, spend years quietly working exactly as intended, and never once be tested against anything as extreme as a dissolution coil or a research lab 400 light-years from home. It was not a grim thought. It had stopped being a grim thought somewhere in the 18 months since the Corvette first touched down at the forward station, settling instead into something steadier. The understanding that the discipline she taught was never really about the worst day. It was about making sure that on the worst day, if it came, there would be a version of yourself calm enough to meet it, and a record afterward honest enough to say, plainly, what it had cost and what it had saved. The Pines kept their low, constant murmur through every season the program ran, indifferent to graduations and deployments, and the quiet accumulation of small corrections that never made headlines anywhere the general public would ever read. Iris Vance kept teaching, kept training, kept counting the pulse in her own wrist down to the same steady, unhurried number she had carried into a conquered execution chamber and out the other side of it. And if anyone had asked her, in those quiet years, what the whole of it had actually been for, she would have told them the truth, in the same flat, unadorned cadence she had used on a magistrate who once mistook her calm for surrender. It was never about being unafraid. It was about being the one thing, in a room built to end you, that finished exactly what it set out to do.